Hello and welcome to the first of this doctoral consortium series of panel discussions on architecture and philosophy. This particular session will be on Walter Benjamin, and I'm delighted that I'm being joined by Graeme Gilloch and Esther Lesie. Esther Lesie actually has sent me a video. She is joining by live stream. And I'd sort of say a few words about what this initiative is all about. In the summer, we hosted a series of lectures by some key thinkers: Slavoj Žižek, Sanford Quinter, Manuel de Landa, Erin Manning, Anna Maria Callisto-Duran, and so on, which were part of this, the first step really in setting up a platform for PhD students worldwide, doctoral students worldwide. The idea that of having a single professor in a single classroom teaching a small group of students doesn't make sense anymore now that we can actually we can share a single platform across the globe. And not only that, but this platform allows us to be able to reach out to people otherwise we wouldn't be able to reach out to. I'm showing you here the previous the library, the YouTube library of previous sessions. If you take that if you click on the YouTube link at the bottom, you will get your way through to see some of these lectures. And to say something more particularly about this particular session, one of the reasons for doing this is because the other day I was trying to find videos of some of the key thinkers, and I discovered there's very little material available. There's one lecture by Foucault in English, nothing by Deleuze in English, and much of this kind of the work that was going on, especially until before the millennium, kind of is part of the Dark Ages. Very little recordings. And what I'm keen to do is to try and set up a debate, even though the thinkers themselves are not here, to bring in some of the experts to really have a record of a discussion for the future, for students everywhere across the globe, available for free in the spirit of Digital Futures itself. And what I'm also keen to do is to try and bring in some of the individuals who, within the architectural community, shall we say, who were part of this, who studied under these individuals. So we have, for example, in the session on Michel Foucault, we have Sanford Quinter, who was in Paris attending Michel Foucault's lectures. We have Michael Speaks, who did his PhD under Frederick Jameson, and we have Doina Petrescu, who studied under both Jacques Derrida and Hélène Cixous, who will be joining us for a session on those two thinkers, along with, I think, two of the most interesting provocative theoretical architects in the world, Peter Eisenman and Bernard Tschumi, who, of course, collaborated with Derrida. So that session, I think, promises to be something very special. We then have a session on Gilles Deleuze, followed by Judith Butler, followed by Simondon. And I would just point out that we have two extra speakers, Stavros and Andre, who are joining us for the session on Simondon. Things are taking off in a very special way, and I hope this is going to be an important record, an important resource for scholars around the world. Let me simply point out, in terms of this rather difficult to read schedule, and that is that at a certain point, we have the clocks start playing around. So the 31st of October is when the clocks in Europe fall back. So it'll, instead of 4 o'clock, it'll be 3 o'clock then. But then the following week, in America, the clocks fall back. So they go back to 4 o'clock again. Whereas in China, where there is no daylight saving, they will be one hour, starting 1 hour later. And I'd also point out on the 20th, 21st of November, because Helen Frischau is based in Australia, we're going to have a special timing for that session. I might try and see if we can juggle things and make it happen at the ordinary time, but for the moment it's down at a different time, which is going to be very inconvenient, unfortunately, for people in Europe. Anyway, that is the lineup. We could include others. These are the ones that have come largely out of my book, Rethinking Architecture, and largely through the connections within the architectural community of people who have written on these particular thinkers. So to turn to Walter Benjamin, what we're going to do today is to outline broadly to give a kind of sketch background about him and his life. Paradoxically, in a sense, because Graeme Gilloch is going to be talking about the architecture, and as an architect, I'm going to be introducing these thinkers, but maybe from a kind of the ignorant architect's point of view, myself being the ignorant architect, it's probably an accessible way for other architects to engage with them. And the idea really behind it really is to try and tease out whether these thinkers who've had such a profound impact on cultural life, on intellectual thought, what kind of relevance they have today in terms of their thinking. The idea behind including some of these thinkers in Rethinking Architecture, a book that I brought out in 1997, a collection of key texts on architecture by key thinkers, by philosophers and sociologists, was to give architecture a set of tools, a set of critical tools by which to kind of question itself in some senses, in order to reinforce that dialogue. Now those tools are there, but how relevant are they in today's society? What relevance is there in the work of Walter Benjamin, someone who died more than 75 years ago? What relevance is there in the thinking of Walter Benjamin for architecture and urbanism today? Let me start then by welcoming our two speakers, Graeme, Gilloch, and Esther, Lesie. I've put just a few of their books up here on Benjamin. I would personally recommend Myth of Metropolis. My endorsement on the back cover of the paperback, I think, is still there. It is a wonderful book because what I find so interesting is it addresses Benjamin and the city, but it addresses it from the perspective of myth. And I think that, to my mind, is one of the most important aspects of what Graeme teased out in this book, is how the modern metropolis has not got beyond myth, but is precisely enshrouded by myth. And that's a subject that's going to echo through some of the discussions today. Then there's a second book by Graeme on Walter Benjamin, of course, some wonderful work also on Siegfried Kracau, who is lurking in the background, as it were, in the shadows today. And I think a very important thinker as well. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to have a session on Siegfried Kracau, because I think that his work is unbelievably relevant. And then Esther Leslie's work, not looking at the city so much or architecture, but really looking more generally at Walter Benjamin, but written in a beautiful way. She has a wonderful way with language, and she's an exquisite commentator on Walter Benjamin. I recently came across an essay by her on Walter Benjamin, Migrants and Refugees, that was written for the 75th anniversary of Benjamin's death. And it was so poignant, that piece, where she was connecting Benjamin himself as someone who was escaping with all the migrants that we've seen in Europe more recently. So Esther's, and I will be, towards the end, I will be playing a discussion that I had with Esther on the subject of Benjamin and his enduring relevance. So just let me say, here I've got 4 of my own books. I don't want to promote my books, but simply to say, on the right-hand side, The Hieroglyphics of Space, is a book in which to which Graeme contributed, I think, 2 very interesting essays. And the theme of hieroglyphics is going to be something that we're going to be picking up on in some way here. The key book, though, here is Rethinking Architecture on the left-hand side. The Aesthetics of Architecture was a book that I wrote and published in 1999. It's come out in many different languages, that would kind of combine Benjamin and Baudrillard, looking at the principle of anesthesia. I will talk more about that briefly today. And camouflage, finally, there is a chapter on mimesis, one of the most interesting concepts and magical concepts in Benjamin's thinking that Graeme himself has written about. But I want to focus primarily to begin with on Rethinking Architecture, the collection of essays that situated Benjamin in the context of a number of other thinkers. Now, there are other people also that one could think of who were in Benjamin's immediate sort of milieu circle, figures like Bertolt Brecht and so on. But these were the ones that I included in Rethinking Architecture. And I just want to say a few words about them, less about Adorno, but more about Siegfried Kracau and Yorkzimmer. And just simply, I'm putting up here the dates just so you can get a sense of what we're talking about. Yorkzimmer was a thinker who was, in a sense, a generation ahead of the other 3. And he, in many ways, was a kind of a pathfinder whose ideas, in some ways, triggered off other things in the rest of them. So I want to kind of try to contextualize Benjamin's thought in the context of these thinkers and in context of the city itself, the modern metropolis, because if anything, I think Benjamin was a theorist of modernity as urban modernity. So let me start by saying a few words about Yorkzimmer, somebody who was in many ways a kind of tragic figure. He was never accepted into academia, partly because he was Jewish, also because of his kind of iconoclastic way of writing, where he was no longer writing in Hochdeutsch with this kind of very a kind of remote way of thinking, talking about the Renaissance and so on. Instead, he was talking about the city and talking about subjects that maybe others wouldn't have talked about. His a book on money, and what I think I like most of all is an essay that he wrote called Metropolis and Mental Life, which is really a kind of psychological study about the new kind of sensibility that was engendered by the new modernist metropolis, written in 1903, at a time when, frankly, Berlin was not maybe the kind of the bustling, thriving, intense, electric metropolis that it was to be a few years later. They had trams, but they still had horses and carriages and so on. But he spoke about a new sensibility. Zimmel spoke about a new sensibility that was engendered by the intensity of life in the city, which compares to the relaxed rhythms in the countryside. And maybe we should look at this painting, painting by George Grosz to get more of a sense of that intensity. And Zimmel points out that this is a city that is characterized by the shock, where crossing the road can so fray the nerves that the only way to survive in this particular metropolis is by shutting down. He talks about how the creature of this new metropolis is the blasé individual who has learnt to resist the bombardment of sensations, the kaleidoscopic visual sensations, the cacophony of the city, by simply shutting down to all those sensations, as otherwise the stimulation or the overstimulation would be too much. So he already has identified, as it were, a kind of new way of operating in this modern metropolis. I want to know, and then of course, famously, and this is a book that was edited by David Frisby, who Graeme and I know very well. Sadly, he's passed away. David Frisby, I should say, also has a master's in architecture from the Mackintosh School in Glasgow. I examined him. And also David translated some of the texts for Rethinking Architecture, particularly Bridge and Door. And I think what is so interesting about the philosophy of money is not just simply the fact that he was addressing a topic that was otherwise not seen as deserving of attention, but he manages to kind of to present it as though it is how we operate in the city. The circulation of money, the abstract circulation of money is akin to the kind of disinterested circulation of this blasé individual. It's very much part of the logic of the city itself. And the commodity, as we will see in Benjamin, becomes another crucial aspect of the modernist metropolis. I want to show you a video of starting off with one-way street, which is a very typical Benjaminian sort of image of what from a wonderful movie, The Symphony of the City, that came out in 1927, that gives more of a sense of, let's say, how that the metropolis had emerged by the time that Benjamin was kind of really in his prime, into this kind of bustling cosmopolitan city, a city that kind of is technologically advanced. Part of this looks like almost a scene from Metropolis, and then a kind of scene from the cafe. And I see Benjamin as kind of the voice from the cafe in many ways in how he's operating. But this was a very sophisticated metropolis, a very cosmopolitan metropolis, something that maybe we were not aware of. But Berlin really was flourishing in the 1920s and became one of the centers in many ways of many things, of nightlives as well, and also a city of the commodity. And I think this is one of these interesting aspects of how Benjamin understood modernity as something that in some sense was caught up in a kind of messianic fervor. Capitalism, as Benjamin once commented, is like a dreams-filled sleep that swept over Europe, reactivating mythic forces. And I think this is precisely the comment that I find so interesting, or the approach that in Graeme's work, the idea that the contemporary city did not get beyond myth in the logic of the dialectic of the Enlightenment. Rationality and myth are in some ways linked, and rationality, modernity, brings with it certain mythic traits. And the commodity is itself something that is in many ways fetishized. Benjamin talks about how products kind of appear, as it were, in the city, conjured up as if from nowhere. Lobsters from Maine, or champagne from France, and they are there, and they're almost magically positioned there. But this idea somehow of the city being something enshrouded by myth, to my mind, is one of the most extraordinary insights that we have. And we see also in this modern metropolis that the signs may be of something else, of another something brewing beneath the surface. So on the one hand, this old lady going into the church in some senses speaks about another age, although the age of the commodity was itself a kind of, where the commodity was fetishized, had its own religious edge to it. But so too we begin to sort of see the beginnings of another kind of state, which Benjamin and many others were only too aware of. And I think what I find astonishing about the approach of people like Benjamin and Zimmel and Krakauer is that they were able to see with a certain insight what modernity was all about, with a clarity which I don't think we even can get today. Some of the things that they observed are remarkable in their own kind of right. And to my mind, the message is enduring today as it ever was. So I want to just say briefly, so this is Graeme's territory, so my apologies for treading on your territory, Graeme. But I think what I would want to point out is the Zimmel and Krakauer, so Benjamin and Krakauer were very close. They worked together in the Frankfurter Zeitung, and they were both due to make it to the States to escape from Europe. Krakauer made it, became a very famous film theorist. Adorno made it, Brecht made it, but Benjamin did not. But I think what I find interesting is the way in which they were sort of beginning to sort of find a way of reading and understanding the city, seeing the city as a kind of hieroglyphic text that was there to be deciphered. And what Krakauer found was that, I think, many ways, was that the city itself was so it was kind of unconscious in the sense it was just the state of things. It was almost like the Freudian slip, or the and Benjamin often talks about that you get the optical unconscious, and a photograph things that are not there, but nonetheless not intended to be there, but nonetheless reveal something. And it's their surface level that allows them to somehow reveal themselves and to reveal the state of things. So the idea somehow that the city could be seen as some kind of hieroglyphic text that could be decoded in order to understand the state of things is something that I think that is shared both by Krakauer and also by Benjamin. And so too, some of these kind of these astonishing kind of comments. That one of the essays that Krakauer writes is on the hotel lobby, which is somehow a quintessential space of modernity, contrasted to the church, and where individuals are somehow kind of isolated, alone in some kind of transcendental homelessness, and in the hotel lobby where they bury themselves in their newspapers instead of engaging in conversation. And it seemed to me this image, which kind of it reminds you, this is Edward Hopper, of the kind of depiction of that Edward Hopper had of the city itself, was again something that was astonishingly sort of rich. But in Krakauer too, and this is a fantastic series of essays, the Mass Ornament, which are brilliant in many ways, where he looks at the aspects of the city, the iconic aspects of the city like the Tiller Girls and so on, and begins to decode contemporary society. On the right-hand side, you can see what it all leads to. The idea of kind of the mass ornament inevitably leads to a kind of a popularism, which we see today in places like the States and under Trump and so on, a kind of enduring kind of memory. And what I find also is interesting is the way that in which Krakauer somehow sees in this abstract rationality, and here a kind of a glimpse of the Tiller Girls, how this itself somehow, the empty abstraction of what he calls ratio, a kind of way of thinking that is it's not liberated in any way, it's a kind of murky form of thinking, is somehow ready to be colonized by the mythic. And he himself sort of pointed out how these kind of behaviors lend themselves to a kind of a mythic edge, which of course we saw in the cult of the personality in Hitler himself, and I would claim also in the cult of the personality of someone like Trump. But that's my own particular kind of viewpoint. But it was people like this who kind of really influenced Benjamin. Benjamin also influenced them, but it was in this milieu of this intense kind of Jewish society, a kind of intellectual society, a kind of one that was kind of challenging in many ways the dominant norms, and opening up things in an important way, and seeing the city as really the essence of modernity, of giving us a glimpse about what things are about. And Benjamin himself, of course, was brought up in a very bourgeois world of the Berlin that I was showing you in many ways, a very comfortable existence, and yet during the course of his life, he had anything but a comfortable life, and was constantly having to kind of avoid the threat of fascism itself. To live is to leave traces. This is a kind of comment that Benjamin made, and you can see a kind of similarity with the idea of hieroglyphics in the work of Krakauer. But importantly for Benjamin, it really wasn't just about so to be an historian was not just simply to decode those traces, but there was an important social project going on. For Benjamin, the whole, there's no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism. He saw modernity in many ways as being a tragic kind of a situation in which people were crushed, almost like like civilization was some kind of steamroller and crushing individuals in its path. And for Benjamin, it was important to be aware of the individuals, not the famous people, but those who've been crushed by history itself. And he saw his project as that of redeeming the buried fragments, shall we say, of those who had been crushed by history. And he saw the city as a kind of like a text where he would go kind of, as it were, botanizing on the asphalt, trying to understand the nature of things through the city. And it was in these liminal spaces of the arcades, and I won't say much about this because I know that Graeme will be talking about this, but it was in these kind of spaces that he really saw the essence of modernity. In writing, as it were, kind of a prehistory of the modern, he saw these in their state of obsolescence, something that was kind of revealing itself. And these were the marginal spaces where he focuses attention. Famously, of course, his arcade project, the Passagenwerk, which was only published in English fairly recently, was a kind of culmination, a fragmentary culmination of his work. It wasn't completed, it remained in fragments, but in many ways it sums up Benjamin's approach, because the fragment was in any case, part of his way of thinking. And to my mind, what I see Benjamin as is as a kind of collector of many things, and above all, a collector of ideas. And when you dig into the Arcades project and find these astonishingly rich ideas, and then join the dots, as it were, in your own kind of way, that to my mind is why Benjamin has remained so popular, in the sense that he opens up new ways of thinking. The constellation was a notion that he had, that you, rather than define things precisely, you would loosely articulate it through a series of points, a bit like the constellations in the sky that we interpret in certain ways. And for him, the way that we understand the world is through this kind of constellation of shards. So it was in this metropolis, of the shock above all, that Benjamin wrote, especially with a number of portraits of cities that Graeme so eloquently describes in his book. And in these marginal spaces were also the marginal individuals who colonized, who lived in these spaces. On the left-hand side, the flaneur, the famous figure of Benjamin that he took from Baudelaire, this kind of disinterested observer who is in some senses, trying to resist the onslaught of modernity. Famously, there's a story about the flaneur taking a turtle, I think it was a tortoise, for a walk, as a way of kind of slowing down modernity. And then the rag picker, maybe one could really see Benjamin himself in the rag picker. And then the prostitute, which to my mind is an incredibly interesting figure in Benjamin's thinking, because not only do we find in Benjamin's thinking that the commodity has been fetishized, but also that the sex has been commodified. In a beautiful kind of combination, somehow the prostitute and the flaneur and the rag picker sum up these places, the kind of the marginal figures within a marginal spaces of modernity. And of course, so too, along with Krakauer, he was there and he picked up on what was going to happen. The tragedy, of course, he didn't act on it himself quickly enough, but he picked up on this. And there's one small kind of comment towards the end of the work of art essay, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproducibility, as the title has been retranslated, where he comments on the possibility on what happens when you aestheticize politics, when you see politics in terms through a kind of aesthetic lens. And this, of course, is Albert Speer's Cathedral of Light. Albert Speer being an architect who choreographed and orchestrated this spectacle in Nuremberg of SS rally for Hitler. And he makes this comment that all efforts to render politics aesthetic culminate in one thing: war. And how right he was. Not only did he pick up on the growth of fascism, but he predicted the war itself. And this itself, to my mind, was something that I took forward. And I won't talk about this in detail, but just to say that I picked up the notion of this problem of aestheticization. Aestheticization is when you see things only in terms of the image, and you rinse out the social and the political and the economic from that sort of outlook. And therefore it becomes a form of anesthetization. In a paradoxical way, aesthetics and anesthetics are combined. You somehow you lose sense of some of the kind of crucial images when you're caught up in the world of images. And of course, this feeds on into the work of Baudrillard, as we will see next week, when Baudrillard also addresses the theme of aestheticization. In my book, The Anesthetics of Architecture, if there's one image that sums up the whole thing, it's this one. And I normally ask my students to tell me which night of the year this fireworks display comes up in, and they're thinking, is it January the 1st, is it November the 5th, or July the 4th, or the 14th, or whatever. In fact, I think it was the 1st of February. This is the first night of activities in the first Gulf War. What we take to be fireworks are in fact the machinery of war. And the principle of aestheticization is that you can look at this image and say, how amazing, isn't this spectacular? And lose sense of the horror that goes on beyond that, behind that. And the point about that in the context of architectural culture is, once you reduce architectural culture to a series of glossy magazines, you somehow also aestheticize things. I also think that in the way that architects handle the question of financial issues, they never address that. If you look at any book on architectural history, you'll find that the only reference to economic concerns is the price of the book on the back cover. So the principle of aestheticization is something I see that is inherent in architectural culture today. But Benjamin escaped all that, went to Paris to where he was working on the Arcades project in the library there. And eventually he realized he had to escape even further. And he had a ticket to the States, and he was just desperately trying to make his way out of France and cross the border into Spain, and where he tragically he met his end. This is Port Bou on the border, on the south, just south of the border with France, and this is where Benjamin crossed the border. And the stories of what happened there and what he had with him are all very apocryphal. Did he have a suitcase full of kind of manuscripts of his Arcades project? We don't know. He apparently was not turned back at the border, but allowed to stay one night in Port Bou, and then was being told to go the next day. I heard a story, I don't know if Graeme will corroborate on this, that they were trying to get some bribe out of him. But by this time, Benjamin had no money left. He was absolutely impoverished. He certainly couldn't have offered any bribes. And he stayed in a hotel overnight and then took his own life. His tomb is in Port Bou, and on his tomb, possibly the most famous comment that he made, or a famous quote from him: "There is no document of civilization that is not also a document of barbarism." And in Port Bou itself, there's an amazing installation, a sculpture by Danny Caravan, the Israeli sculptor, that really very powerfully evokes the kind of condition in some ways of Benjamin. This kind of this Corten steel shaft that's got a series of steps that goes down towards the Mediterranean, but somehow is blocked by a sheet of glass, on which he had inscribed this comment about the need for the social historian to redeem the buried fragments, to tell the stories of those who have been vanquished by history, the marginal people, of which, of course, Benjamin himself, in some senses, was very much part of this. I will just finish with a rather kind of curious incident in Port Bou, and that is to say that Norman Foster, for a while, I don't think it's been built, but he did a proposal for a museum of Walter Benjamin in Port Bou. So with that note, and that was just a kind of very brief background for an architect, as it were, I'd like to invite Graeme Gilloch, who is one of the great authorities on Benjamin, and especially on Benjamin and the city, to say a few words. So I have the slides here, and Graeme, let me know when you want to move on, and I'll move on to the next slide. So welcome, Graeme Gilloch. Graeme is a professor at the University of Lancaster. He is, as I mentioned, the author of many books on Benjamin, and is an authority above all on Krakauer. I first came across his book back in 1997, his first book, and was enthralled by the way that he opened up Benjamin in relation to the city. So welcome, Graeme Gilloch.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you for those kind words. It's really lovely to see you again. We've known each other for many years, and I think we first met back in Nottingham back in the middle of the 1990s when you kindly asked me to come over and give a paper back there. So back then, so it's lovely to see you again, and it's lovely to be part of this project, which seems a wonderful project of bringing ideas and discussion and chances for discussion across the world to look at some wonderful thinkers and explore ideas together. And I'd like to just thank everybody for coming along and joining in today. And I hope you have a really interesting session, and that this inspires you and gives you lots of ideas to take forward and to be creative with in your own work, in your own projects, and to contribute and bring ideas together here today. So it's lovely to be here. It's a real honour to be here, and it's a real honour as well to be with Neil and with Esther as well, whose work is, I think, some of the finest work on Benjamin and on Krakauer as well, and some of those beautifully written work on these writers. Neil, thank you so much for that introduction on Benjamin. I'm just going to do something very simple today, really, which is try and sort of cover a few ideas that I think why Benjamin may be interesting for those of you who are studying or working in architecture or with looking at urban space. I'm not an architect myself. I'm not an urban planner. I'm a sociologist. I work in social and cultural theory. So I come at this from a rather naive perspective, perhaps. Benjamin himself, of course, was no architect. Krakauer had, in fact, was trained as an architect, but Benjamin had no formal architectural training. So I'm here just really to give you some sense of why I think Benjamin is such an interesting figure, perhaps for architects, urbanists, and others. And I'm going to take, I just have a very few slides. I haven't got anything quite as elaborate and fancy as Neil has presented. I'm going to keep it just very simple, very stripped back. And also, I hope that gives an opportunity for people to join in and ask questions and make comments. So I'm just sort of taking one concept from Benjamin here, and that is the idea of the Denkbild, the thought image or the thought form. And I'm going to run with one particular image, and I'm going to sort of spin out from that some ideas which are fairly sort of, I'm not going to develop in great detail, but I'm just going to give a sort of sense of how these ideas may connect together, linked to architecture, and may be interesting today. So if we move on to the next slide, what do we mean by Denkbild? And I think there are two things. One is that it's a figure that's found in Benjamin's own writing, and obviously the literal translation of this is as a thought image where ideas come together in some way to coalesce into a moment of insight, perhaps, or form a figure of some description. But it's also a figure then as the notion of an image for thinking, the way an image itself may be something useful to think with. And that's how I'm kind of think of this notion of a Denkbild today. And I'm actually going to present just one image, which is an image, if we can move on to the next slide, which is this one. And I'm going to use this as a sort of basis for what I am going to say today. This is a painting that was actually it's actually an ink drawing from 2016 by the Indian British artist Jasmine Creed. I came across this picture for the first time at a small exhibition at Delta Studios in London back in 2017, an exhibition called Urban Forests. It's a picture called Steel Webs. And I just walked into the little gallery space. I was there actually to see a friend. And this image had a real impact upon me. I really loved the image. I was really drawn to it. I found it a fascinating image. I just thought that it would be interesting perhaps to use this image as a point of departure, as a way of concentrating our or focusing our discussion today. For me, why did it resonate so much for me? I mean, I loved some of the other images that Jasmine had made as well. I love the fact that Jasmine actually lives about 10 minutes walk away from me here in Manchester, which I didn't know. I saw her work for the first time in London. Why did this image make such an impact upon me? And perhaps it's because for me, it brings together, or I just saw in it, so many of the themes that I had worked on many years earlier on Benjamin and cities, which I try and deal with in Myth and Metropolis and in other writings that I've done on Benjamin and Krakow. So for me, this image seemed to, as I said, bring together so many facets, so many dimensions of Benjamin's reading of urban space, urban time, urban experience, urban crowds. It's kind of interesting also that Jasmine herself is someone who's very heavily influenced by Benjaminian ideas and motifs. So I thought what might be interesting today in this session would be to take this image and maybe use it as a sort of point of departure for thinking through some of Benjamin's key categories. So I hope you've all had a nice opportunity to sort of study this image a little bit. So let's move on, perhaps, Neil, to the next slide. So what are the kind of key themes? I said I'm going to keep this very simple, very sort of sparse and stripped back. So for me, it really is suggestive of 5 aspects of Benjamin's work in relation to the city. Benjamin is a kind of key thinker of spatio-temporal configurations. The first sort of theme I'm going to put under the label, the rubric of the notion of construction. I want to look at that in a moment in more detail, what I mean by that. Second, ideas of spatiality, the organization, distribution, and occupation of space, which is, of course, in a way, what architecture is an organization of materials and spaces. The third kind of key aspect for Benjamin and the city, as I understand it, it would be relating to the notion of the experience precisely of these spatial configurations of forms of organization, stumbling over my own words here. And the transformation, above all, the transformation of time and space and our experience of time and space, the transformation of bodily and embodied experience, the transformation of perception with the new tempos of urban living. We've seen that captured in Yorkzimmer's essay, The Metropolis and Mental Life, that Neil mentioned earlier. We've seen it exemplified in the sort of Gail Gross painting of the sort of shock experience and chaotic experience of the city. We've seen it also in notions of loneliness and isolation in Siegfried Krakau's work, The Hotel Lobby, which is from his long extended study of the detective novel. And we've seen it also in Walter Ruttmann's film that Neil was showing some excerpts from the Berlin Symphony of a Great City from 1927, which is very much concerned with trying to present the everyday experience, the day in the life, in actual fact, of a contemporary city and its competing rhythms, its machinic pace, the experience of different social classes, and trying to bring these together in into a sort of totality through the use of images and music. And that leads on to this fourth dimension about the notion of representation, that the city is a site of foregrounding particular new media, for instance, that could only be perhaps captured and represented through particular new media forms. Of course, for Benjamin, primarily the development of film and cinema. But interestingly, the original experience of modernité, from the modernity that derives from Baudelaire, is captured by the pen and ink drawings, like Jasmine Creed, the pen and ink drawings of the painter of modern life, Constantine Guy, back in the Painter of Modern Life essay from 1863. And the final theme I thought that was really important with regards to the city is this notion of afterlife. And by that, I'm going to mention a kind of concern which links with the notion that Neil mentioned earlier of the notion of the mythology of the city. The notion of the mythology of the city, or myth moderne, of course, comes from André Breton and Louis Aragon's works, the surrealist works, The Paris Peasant and Nadia. And Benjamin is very attracted and drawn to the kind of surrealist vision of the city. And the surrealist vision of the city took cognizance of the transformation of urban space, its happenstances, but also its transformation through the process of ruination, the destruction of the arcades. The arcades were on the point of demolition. They'd become ruins in the modern city. And this had attracted the attention of Louis Aragon, and through Aragon, then of Benjamin himself. So there's this notion of ruination, and then we'll come on to look at these other temporal dimensions of the city as well, which give it a sense of, I think the word, perhaps the best word to capture it is, of the unheimlich, of the uncanny, but also at the same time a particular political dimension. And here the role of memory and recovery and redemption, salvage work, is also vital. So shall we move on to the first of these, notion of construction? As we know, probably Benjamin was very interested in the arcades, and he's interested in them as architectural structures, new architectural structures, the creation of new kinds of spaces, not just the arcade, but those other forms of structures built around the same time in a similar style, railway stations, department stores as well, but also the great exhibitions as well. And this notion of the use of iron and glass, and this, in particular, this idea of construction as an assemblage, of a piecing together of pieces, of finely wrought components, mass produced and then used to assemble a totality. This idea, actually, I think, is very important for Benjamin. The Eiffel Tower is a structure that he mentions as being a sort of a definitive modern construction in this sense. And this notion of construction, I think, links very well to the Jasmine Creed's painting, which is called Steel Webs. And the top part of the painting, of course, is a whole series of these struts and interlacings, if you like, of these components. And I think this is this brings together a nice idea about the notion of architecture as a web-like structure. Here we are in a webinar. We talk about urban architecture, urban space, but the notion of a web also, of course, brings together virtual spaces and virtual architectures as well. And I'm mentioning this because if we look at Jasmine Creed's painting, there's something very, for me, very sort of sinister and disturbing about these web-like structures which seem to be hanging in the air, threatening these kind of this myriad crowd below. And it made me think about the notion of the web and the idea of a spider's web, a spider Arachne, the great nature's great architect, of course. And the notion of a web as both a lair and the web as a lure. as well. And I guess how our appreciation of the web, whether we appreciate its architecture or not, whether we appreciate its beauty or not, depends on your viewpoint. It depends upon whether you're the spider, it depends on whether you're the fly that's stuck in this web, trapped in this web. Something that we might want to think about as we negotiate the web ever more as in our online lives. But what's interesting for me regarding Benjamin and this notion of these web-like architectural forms, these spaces that are created which are illuminated by daylight from above, he says. And he compares the Eiffel Tower as well to this sort of web-like structure, is that it becomes for him a model of a kind of textual practice. That texts themselves are these built out of fragmentary components. So the construction of buildings, this construction of architecture becomes a model of how you assemble and create writings as well, texts, and how those texts are experienced. So from a series of finely wrought components brought together and assembled, this gives a kind of notion of, well, it's a kind of modern mosaic, I guess. It replaces the idea of a textual mosaic with a much more modern, a much more industrial, a much more urban and metropolitan vision of textual production. And Benjamin, for me, is one writer who's continually playing with the relationship between text and spatial experiences. So the text itself becomes fragmented, the text itself becomes seductive, the text itself becomes labyrinthine. The text itself then plays a kind of goal, Neil used the word mimesis earlier on, plays perhaps a mimetic relationship with urban spaces. Neil, can we move on? To the next slide.
Can you see spatiality?
Ah, yeah, that's missing. I can't see that on the bottom. Yeah, spatiality is the next one. Yeah.
Oh, it should be up there now.
Ah, I've still got construction. Maybe they're stuck.
Well, no, I think it's maybe a time lag in the. Can I just ask G? Can you see spatiality?
I don't know, but
you can't.
No, I think we're stuck.
How about that? Let me stop sharing a second and just
yeah. Sorry, everybody. Talk amongst yourselves. Yeah. Any questions? Please put the questions in the chat, and maybe they can be relayed.
What do you see now?
We're on to experience now. Do you want to flip one back?
Well, okay, I think I might have to go off just to. Okay, hang on a second. Spatiality. Okay. I've got it now. Apologies for this. Hold on. Let me just share screen again.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. Right, let me just regain my line of thought. Right, yes. So Benjamin's interested in this notion of construction. Iron construction is interested in the relationship between the constructions of text and the experiences of text, experiences of reading, and the experience and constructedness of urban spaces, urban settings, and the very fabric of the city buildings and other settings within the city itself. And this leads us to think about how he understands spatiality and temporality as well, and his attraction towards particular sites of the city. I've already mentioned the arcades, and we've seen some images in Neil's presentation of the arcades. He's interested in precisely these kinds of what we might call in-between places, Zwischenräume, as Siegfried Krauer Krakow terms them. Schwellen as well, thresholds, liminal sites, the sort of spaces that are often overlooked, the spaces that are at the side of things or between things, that these sort of neglected and perhaps neglected and derided spaces as well. These spaces have become important for him. In fact, their importance grows the more that they become actually seen as neglected in everyday life. So the arcades are a kind of classic example of this. As they fall into ruin, as they fall into disuse, as they become unpopular with consumers and customers and the to and fro of everyday traffic, as they become overlooked, Benjamin's attraction to them increases. And this is very much within the spirit of surrealism, who are looking precisely for these cast off, cast out spaces, sites and objects of everyday life within the city. So Benjamin's attraction to the arcades is precisely at the moment of their dereliction and ruination. I'll come back to this notion of ruination in a little while. But then Benjamin is then fascinated by precisely these sites of indeterminacy, precisely by the crossing, the movement from one space to another. Krakow is also fascinated precisely by these spaces as well, but also those spaces of lingering, those spaces of boredom, those spaces where of what Marc Auger, the anthropologist, describes as non-lieu, non-spaces, spaces where people sit in on transportation systems, spaces where people have to fill the time, spaces of boredom and doing nothing. Precisely these kind of spaces, the kind of spaces that Krakow and Benjamin are drawn to and interested in. We've already seen the hotel lobby, the cafe, for instance, might be these kinds of sites. So the neglected becomes an object of fascination for Benjamin. His interest in the arcades is also because they are, in their use of glass, they are pioneering architectural sites, but also then ones that are subject to a whole series of optical illusions and trickery. The use of mirrors, for instance, to multiply spaces becomes important within them. The use of glass itself to create the illusion of transparency and availability of commodities. The whole idea of window shopping comes about in these kinds of shopping spaces like the department store and the arcade. So when you're walking up and down the arcade, you're confronted by a series of frames, glass frames in which commodities are being presented to you. And of course, Benjamin's attraction or interest in the arcades was precisely because they were at one time, when they were first built, the sites of commodity culture and luxurious commodity culture as well. They were seen as the most fashionable sites for the commodities being brought in to Paris in particular, but not just Paris. The arcades flourished in many other cities as well, like London and Milan, Manchester. Even here we have one, the Barn Arcade, from about 1870. That they become then these sites of luxurious goods and parts of also of the imperial system as well, the colonial system, where goods are brought from many parts of the world to be displayed and shown. So these are about sites not just of economic development, but also about imperial military exploitation as well. This is where these are the kind of temples to the burgeoning consumer capitalism of the late 19th century. And they are also sites then of where these objects are then put into display through notions of montage and configuration. And this notion of montage and configuration is kind of very important for Benjamin in his reading of surrealism, because surrealism is precisely about the bringing together of obsolete objects, the remainders, the detritus, the traces of objects, the unfashionable that linger and are leftovers, if you like, in the city, the sort of what is now were once fashionable but now become trash items, kitsch items, which linger only in these shops within the arcades, and then are brought into new configurations, disturbing configurations. So just as the shop window starts off by these kind of forms of display, the practice of that display of commodities becomes something that the surrealists then rework, rejig through as a situation, what the situationists much later called détournement, by creating disturbances and displacing items. So they're putting new juxtapositions and new configurations, which explode or detonate or pour scorn upon the former pretensions of fashionable commodities. The other aspect of spatiality I think is really important for Benjamin is the notion of the labyrinthine and of digressions. And this again goes back to this notion of textuality. And Benjamin's own interest in walking in cities, in being lost in the city, of roaming and wandering, and we'll come back to this in a moment when we talk about the notion of experience. But the labyrinth becomes a figure that fascinates Benjamin. And of course, here again, we see that connection with the notion of mythology. And Benjamin, again, it sort of invokes the figure of Theseus and the pathfinder, of course, within the labyrinth, the figure of Ariadne. And Benjamin sees the notion of sort of wandering in a labyrinth also as a textual strategy and a way of thinking as well. Time and again, he says we return to the same spot, like a kind of archaeologist, that our thought processes, the process of critique, the process of investigation, of analysis, is always one of digression, is always one of detours and diversions. And so in a way, the kind of experience of the city, of wandering the city, of wandering its back streets, of being lost, becomes a way also of thinking about the processes of textual analysis and writing itself. So moving on. Okay, so the city then, and this kind of architecture becomes a site of new kinds of experiences. And these are kind of captured, first of all, by, perhaps most beautifully by Charles Baudelaire in his book, his essay, The Painter of Modern Life, where he coins this term modernité to refer to a sort of artistic practice about capturing the fleeting, the fugitive, the contingent. This notion of modernité or modernity, we're going to take call it that, is also then about temporal, spatial, and as I said here, perceptual transformation, new forms of experiences of the body, of the eye within the city. And this is precisely what Zimmel is concerned with in his essay, Metropolis and Mental Life from 1903, which had a very profound effect upon both Benjamin and on Krakow as well. For Benjamin, there are a number of figures and a number of sort of tropes which are important when thinking about urban experience, the new rhythms, the new tempo, the new speed of everyday life, the new fragmentation and chaos of the urban setting, this life among anonymous strangers, this encounter with the crowd and figures in the crowd, which is, you know, incredibly momentary encounters, momentary experiences with figures who then rush past each other and are never seen again, most famously captured in Baudelaire's famous sonnet To a Passerby, à une passant. And from these, we get then a whole host of figures that emerge from this shock encounter with the crowd, shock encounter with space, or shock encounter with time as well. And most famously, of course, is the figure of the sort of the wanderer, the flaneur or the flaneuse, a very developed literature now on the female walker in the city as well. And these figures of flaneur and the flaneuse have become ways of trying to understand all kinds of experiences around mobility. Part of the mobility's term in social sciences. Also ways of trying to think about new forms of other forms of motion as well, sort of like flanners online, browsers, car drivers, all kinds of figures are now being sort of connected to these kind of figures of disinterested movement within urban space. And these figures also connected with others, the journalist, the detective, and Benjamin, of course, was very interested in the detective story, as was Krakow and its urban setting. And the figures also like the gambler, a figure who experiences not so much the shock of the crowd, but the shock of monetary loss, the shock of time, in which there's a kind of vertiginousness of time rather than space, and other figures as well, such as the rag picker, the figure that Neil's already mentioned, redeeming the detritus of everyday life, a figure that for Baudelaire becomes an image of the poet himself, herself. Benjamin talks about the sort of shift and transformation of experience from some sort of coherent notion of experience, something that's relatable, something that we're able to make sense of, that seems integrated, whole, meaningful and coherent. The notion of ephemeral, and it's much more disturbed, fragmented particles of experience that we now encounter that seem dissociated from one another. And this is given the term Erlebnis. So the shift from ephemeral to Erlebnis is this shift towards metropolitan living, this shift towards a different kind of experience of the city. And this kind of disturbance or destruction of experiences, new kinds of experiences, new possibilities of experience, are also bound up with shifts in the notion of memory. Benjamin himself was fascinated by the work of Marcel Proust, and the memoir Involuntary Memory. Benjamin's also interested in the way in which memory itself is maybe transformed or perhaps even threatened. The possibilities of remembering may be are certainly shaped by and perhaps destroyed by this new form of fragmentation and shock experience. Again, multiple readings of this. Shock is both something that we remember, and is also shock is something that disturbs us such that we fail to remember. We block out those memories, we repress those. That's the notion of traumatic memory, of course, is both the irony of the traumatic events is remembered and yet unprocessed as well. So for Benjamin, the great fear, and this goes back to the notion of the commodity. Adorno reads the commodity fetishism as an act of amnesia, the idea of forgetfulness, the idea that of a society without memory, of an urban space without memory, is one of the great sort of fears that haunts the work of the Frankfurt School. And Krakow writes an essay, Streets Without Memory, precisely about the way in which capitalism wipes away, eradicates earlier buildings and enterprises, sweeps them away, wipes them out completely to be replaced by the new. So if you move on again, Neil. So it's talked about the city and experience, and of course what Benjamin's also interested in here is how to capture this, how to give representation to this. I've already mentioned that the city becomes a model of a sort of writing practice for him. But interestingly, architecture itself becomes a model in its sort of proximity, its tactility, its availability, its publicness of the transformation of media and media technologies at the end of the 19th century, or from the mid-19th century onwards into the early 20th century. And of course, the main aspect of this, as Neil's already mentioned, is the rise of film and photography, as documented in the essay, The Work of Art in its Age of Technological Reproducibility, the very famous essay from 1935-1936. where he talks about the demise of aura, the demise of the sense of distance in the presence of the unique artwork, the painting or the sculpture or whatever it may be, the unique work of art, the original, the singular piece of work, which evokes a sense of reverence from us, or a sense of awe and wonder. And this is dissipated, or this starts to collapse where we have these new technologies which collapse that sense of distance, brings us up close to things, becomes a public rather than a private and personal and individual experience that also accelerates the tempo of our reception, such that we are now receiving images, watching images in a state much more of distraction rather than concentration. And these new technologies, of course, bring new optical and perceptual possibilities. Neil's already mentioned this term, the optical unconscious. The optical unconscious is where we see the world in a new way, new elements of the world, things that have always been there, but that we've never been able to see before. So a kind of classic example of this would be using slow motion to show a flower opening, for instance, things that would be too slow for the eye normally to have seen. But now using the camera, we can see this process unfold before us. It's always been there, but it's been invisible to us. And this is what the optical unconscious is. Things that have been invisible to us, perhaps have been too large, perhaps have been too small, perhaps have been too fast, like the movement of racehorses, for instance. If you look at early pictures of racehorses from the 18th century, Derby Day and things like that, you'll see that the horses are painted in a very strange way because they couldn't see how horses actually moved. The movement of the legs was too quick for them. So it's not until you get film and photography that you're able to break down that notion of motion and actually see the positioning of different limbs of animals as they run or things at speed. So the optical unconscious reveals to us a new world of visual phenomena. And in revealing a new world of visual phenomenon, Benjamin argues that film has enormous energies which it can use to, I think he uses the term, dynamite or detonate the boredom, the frustration, the everyday world around us. So these are revolutionary new media that are going to bring a revolutionary new perception. And this is a new kind of politics that Benjamin sees bound up with these, not the aestheticization of politics, but the politicization of aesthetics, which bring with them and are part of a much more profound revolutionary transformation of everyday life and politics in modernity. If we move on to the last one. So Benjamin's then interest and fascination with the city has a number of dimensions, and the last one I want to talk about here is this notion of afterlife. And by that, I mean the way in which the city is a kind of site of the uncanny for Benjamin. Now, I've already mentioned that this is sort of tied up with the surrealists and how the arcades themselves are very much part of this urban uncanny, that they, as they collapse, as they become ruins, they become of interest because their original claims, their original fashionability is stripped away, and the pomposity, the superficiality of fashionability, the superficiality of the commodity, the superficiality of commodity fetishism, of our desires for the commodity. These things are destroyed as they become obsolete. And in this sense, for Benjamin, ruins reveal, in a way, the sort of, if you like, the vanity, the sort of memento mori of the object world, in a way. They reveal the pomposity, they reveal the claims that have been made about these objects as objects of luxury, as objects of prestige, as objects of power, for instance. So the process of ruination is a kind of process by which, for Benjamin, the truth, the underlying truth, the transitory, failed, broken, catastrophic nature of things is gradually disclosed. And this ties in with his, goes back again to a literary strategy for him, the idea of critique as a process itself of bringing about the ruination of the text, the ruination or a process of what I'm using here, mortification, in which through this process, the work of art is revealed. What he says, the truth content of the work of art is revealed through time. That the truth of the work of art is not immediately available, but it's through the process of critique, which, if you like, perhaps we use the word today, deconstructs the work of art, takes it apart, sees it as in its elements, as traces. This enables us to see through the enduring truth content as it appears to us in the present. This notion is how the past, how objects from the past, including architectural objects, how they are now seen today, how they appear at a moment of disappearance, he says. And this moment of disappearance in which the object reveals itself, reveals its pretensions, reveals its imbrication within systems of power and control, domination, capitalist exploitation. This moment is the moment of what he calls dialectics at a standstill, the moment of the dialectical image, when the present recognizes and redeems a moment from the past. This is a part of his thesis on the concept of history, which he was written in 1940s, one of the last things he wrote, which was to serve as an introduction to the Arcades project. And it brings me to the final couple of points that I wanted to say about Benjamin and the city. That for me, one of the most important aspects of Benjamin's work around the cities is this idea of the possibility of otherness, the possibility of difference. That this sort of ties in with Mark Fisher's idea of alternative futures. That the city is a haunted space in some way, that is haunted by the ghosts of those who have been unsuccessful in the past. It's haunted by those to whom there are no monuments erected. It's haunted by those whose histories have been subject precisely to erasure, who have been excluded, marginalized, neglected. The tradition of the oppressed, Benjamin terms this. And this is the task of the historian, is to recover this history. So every space then bears the traces of those who were there. It bears the traces in some way of previous lives that have now been forgotten. So here we see this notion of amnesia again is important. For Benjamin, process of remembering not the rich and powerful, the kings and queens, not that version of history, but an alternative version of history, the history of those who have lost in the past. History has been written by the victors, he says, the triumphal monuments that have been put up and are now being taken down, of course, have always been monuments to the powerful. They've always been monuments to those who've succeeded. There is now the need for Benjamin to remember those who have not been commemorated in those in our urban spaces, the ghosts who haunt our spaces. And this leads us onto the final term here, which is this word phantasmagoria, because I think this is a kind of, in a way, this is a key term for understanding Benjamin and the city. Phantasmagoria, ghosts in the marketplace. This is precisely how Benjamin sees the modern city, as something that's haunted by its bad conscience, haunted by ongoing oppression, haunted by those who have suffered and been marginalized, haunted by those whose lives have been cut short, haunted by the oppressed, haunted by the enslaved, haunted by those who have built the city but who seem to have but whose lives have actually seemingly left no trace behind. And it is to the recovery of that, to the redemption of that, that Benjamin's cityscapes and politics, I think, are dedicated. It's this notion of phantasmagoria as a phantasmagoria that returns me to the last slide, which is this one, Jasmine Creed's Steel Webs, which I think for me is the most exquisite capturing of phantasmagoria. And that's where I'm going to stop. So thank you, Neil, for moving those slides on for me, and thank you for listening, everybody. I hope that was interesting. A bit of a whistle-stop tour, I know, of so many different concepts, but I hope we have an opportunity now to speak more about them. So thanks for listening. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Graeme. That was exquisite. I'm going to I've just unshared. I think what I'm going to slightly change my order and play the piece with Esther now. And I was going to do a presentation, and maybe I'll have time at the end. I don't know, but I want to just kind of like play this piece, and then we can have some discussion. That was exquisitely beautiful. Thank you so much, Graeme. I think those words. I mean, I feel like myself as some kind of Benjamin tourist compared to the depth which you were able to kind of penetrate into his thinking there. So let me just show this. I'm going to show you a third of almost half the clip, because we won't have time for all of it, and I think this is the best part of it. But so here we have Esther Lesie. I recorded this. Esther, I hope she's watching now from her train, but I recorded this on Monday. So here's Esther and myself, and I'll show you about 12 minutes or so. I'd like to welcome Esther Lesie here. It's a great honour and a privilege to have Esther here. Esther is one of the great authorities on Benjamin, and from my time back at the UK, I heard it a number of times. And I would say that actually that in the UK there is a very strong fondness for the work coming out of Benjamin in particular. And recently I came across an article that Esther wrote about Walter Benjamin. In the anniversary that was produced the 70th anniversary of his death in Porto. And I'd be very interested to ask Esther about some of her reflections on the piece itself, which is also itself already a reflection on Benjamin. So maybe you could say just a few words about what motivated that particular piece and why you see the enduring relevance in the work and ideas of Walter Benjamin.
The piece, which is called Walter Benjamin, Refugee and Migrant, if I recall correctly, was first written in 2015. I was invited to write it as part of a celebration, commiseration around the 75th anniversary of Benjamin's death, suicide as he was fleeing fascism, the Nazis in Europe, and attempting to cross into Spain on his way to the United States. So I was asked to write a piece on Walter Benjamin now, which raises the question that you ask, it in the sense that it very much sets out from the perspective that Benjamin still has a lot to say to us. And at this event at the Whitechapel, there were some contemporary artists' films that reflected on Benjamin and other talks. And I think it's interesting to say in the United Kingdom there's a fondness for Benjamin, and lots of work goes on, and that's true. But there are also camps and arguments and battles about the meaning. And often when I write about Benjamin, there's a certain element of polemic there, and I think I recognise it in the piece that I wrote, in the sense that Benjamin can be romanticised, and that final journey of his across the Pyrenees, attempting to escape, is an extraordinary journey, and I know there are some efforts to make a Hollywood film about it, and all sorts, because there is something very dramatic there, and it's very easy to sort of to get caught up in the drama of that movement and see it as a tragedy, as almost an inevitable act that would end in failure, and just reinforces this sense of Benjamin, the bungler, the melancholic, the saturnine, and so on. So I think I wanted to look at that journey not just as a closed story of Benjamin's movement, but to open it up, as the memorial by Danny Caravan at Port Bull does too, into a question of the movements of all sorts of refugees in that period, crossing, both flowing from France to Spain or fleeing fascist Spain into France, and a general turmoil. This isn't just about this heroic individual who's going to fail. There's also a certain kind of polemic against a strand in Benjamin's studies that wants to see him as an extremely abstract philosopher whose work is somehow detached from its context. And one of the things I do in my piece is just to see how much Benjamin was embedded in his context. I found some writings in book reviews where I think he has such a sharp analysis of how Nazism came to be in Germany, and he traces it back to the 19th century. Also sort of, think about him as someone who's not just uprooted by the coming to power of Hitler in 1933, who suddenly thinks, oh dear, I better get out of here. He's someone who's developed this criticism and this fascination with capitalism and with urbanization, and that has already uprooted him from his native home of Berlin and sent him to Paris for his extraordinary explorations of the Arcades project. But he's also someone who can't get a university job, partly because he's a Jew, partly because of his political outlook, and there may be other reasons too. Maybe he had an antipathy towards that sort of work in a way. But so he's poor. He's always scrabbling for work, and so he takes on radio shows or writing journals, or he goes into a sort of self-managed exile, in a sense, to cheaper parts of Europe, where he's able to live in a cave virtually, and write and survive and be able to eat. So I wanted to reinforce also the material Benjamin, as someone attempting to live as a writer, as a journalist under capitalist conditions. So all of that is there. And so because of that, I also start to think about his exposure within cities, his fascination with the specific architecture of Berlin or of Paris, or city planning. This is someone who spends a lot of time walking to the library where it's a bit warmer, so he can sit in there and do his work. And he passes through very evocatively named parts of the city, and this gets him to think very much about the sort of the city we pass through, the city and the kind of poetry of the city as it resolves itself within our heads, the city of imagination, the city as somewhere that's a collation of colonial impulses that come through in the names of places or in the movements of people into those cities. So, he's understanding this world as alive, a very alive and dynamic space of movements, which is legible in some way, and not just in a arid, this building was built at this time and made of these materials, but really deeply in terms of how this place is named can tell us about the history of colonial exploration, for example, and the movements of people. But what we come to see is also marked by the power relations in the present. So I was trying to shovel all of these different themes about Benjamin's migration and other people's migrations, and then how that shifts historically into becoming a refugee, because for Benjamin at a certain point he couldn't just travel to Ibiza or Capri or Paris or Moscow or the north of Sweden and so on. He couldn't just do that and return. There comes a point when there is no return, just as there is for many people today. And of course, this piece was written as well in response to shifting politics of migration that have been occurring over the last period, the reinforcing of borders, the emergence of fortress Europe, and also the developing across time of more fortress-like border conditions within the USA. And the piece was reposted online in 2019, and I think that was very much in response to new developments around Brexit and the ending of certain kinds of freedom of movement, coupled with an extremely hostile migration politics in the UK. Of course, in Trump's America, all of the discussion about erecting a wall on the border between the United States and Mexico and so on. And so there's an echo within the piece, or a reflection within the piece, on the Mediterranean as a massive grave of lost bodies of refugees who've tried to cross from outside of Europe, from Europe's fringes, through that sea to other lands, to solid land. And that's provoked in a sense by kind of coming back to the
I'd like to welcome Esther Lesie here. So I'm sorry, it's something we lost it there. I think I'm not quite sure what happened there, but let's. I think we're almost at the end of that piece anyway. So I'm not quite sure what happened. We've also got some red marks on the screen for some reason, and my apologies for the sound. But nonetheless, I think you've got a glimpse there of some very beautiful kind of thoughts coming from Esther. I had prepared something which we might have time for at the end, but I'm thinking now that it'd be good to open up to discussion. We've got some really wonderful people in the audience here today. So I wanted, maybe we could put Graeme's video on and open it up to discussion. Graeme, thank you so much for that. That was really, really fantastic. I think you added layers, that really were open it up in a way that only someone like yourself or Esther could. And it was really, I think that was so illuminating, and precisely why I think it's so important that not only do we read figures like Benjamin, we bring in authorities like yourself to come and explicate and deepen our understanding of that material.
Thank you so much for that, Lou. That's very kind. That's very kind indeed. Thank you.
No, it was fabulous. What I would so we have some. What I wanted. I haven't looked at the chat to see what questions coming out, but let me just simply say that we welcome some questions from the audience at this point. I can see some comments from Haris Al Saidi. I know he's in Iraq, so we're spanning the globe today. Maybe I'll just start it off. Can I ask people to put questions in? Also to YouTube, we can I think we can take some questions from there. It seems that Billy's stream is not working today. But maybe I can kick things off in some ways. I mean, I think one of the beautiful. I think as Esther's essay, what I love about is how, in a sense, she evokes precisely why Benjamin is so relevant today. All the things that he spoke about, absolutely resonating today. And I had discussions over here with with various individuals, actually also online with Zizek, we were discussing how Krakow is so relevant today, especially in the context of Trump politics and the kind of populism of that. And maybe I could just kind of maybe ask you that for both Benjamin and Krakow, why you see their enduring relevance, and in some ways, I think the paradox of Benjamin is he's been kind of raked over. I mean, people have looked at him so many times, and yet, there is so much more there. And one of the comments that Esther makes towards the end of that discussion is the point that every time she reads the work of Art Essay or anything else, something more becomes clear. And I think it's this kind of layered nature of his writing that makes Benjamin so relevant. There's a question in the chat before I hand on for you, is to say that the title of Esther Leslie's essay, it's actually if you just Google Esther Leslie, Walter Benjamin, migrants, refugees, it should come up on Google. I'll try and find the connection myself. Anyway, so Graeme, yes, yes.
Yeah, no, wow. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, so let me just forgive me if these are rather disconnected thoughts, but let us just take the end of the work of Art Essay, for example, and you mentioned the aestheticization of politics and the politicization of aesthetics. Let's just take that concept of the aestheticization of politics. And you presented some interesting examples of that through some of the Speer's Cathedral of Light, but also we could look at the sort of the notion. Well, first of all, one of the interesting things about that is that one of the key workers on the technical side, working with at the filming of the Leni Riefenstahl's filming of the Nuremberg rallies, for instance, was Walter Ruttmann, right? Who made Symphony of a Great City, Berlin Symphony of a Great City, which you were showing. And Ruttmann actually was died as a result of wounds suffered on the Eastern Front in about 1942, making Nazi propaganda films. So it's kind of very interesting the way that someone who there we see them as trying to capture these new rhythms of everyday life, working in the city, right? And fascinated with the machine aesthetic, fascinated with notions of speed, fascinated with technology, produces this film as a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, a sort of total work of art, and then is drawn to these other kinds of forms of spectacle and mass spectacle, this other kind of architecture, an architecture of bodies, a choreography of bodies. Again, very similar to the kind of choreography that Krakow is identifying the Mass Ornament essay, the Tiller girls and their synchronized machine-like, de-individualized movements, the creation of the mass itself as a set of bodies that could be manipulated and shaped, choreographed, orchestrated. This is the stuff of fascism. This is precisely the link. I think it's a really fascinating link between the Mass Ornament essay and the work, that moment at the end of the work of art essay. So what has this all got to do with politics today? Well, I think about the crowd. Think about the way in which the crowd becomes a choreographed tool of populist politics, for instance. Think about the way in which the crowd is used as a kind of call and response device by populist politicians. I've been working for the last few years with a couple of colleagues on an edition of Krakauer's writings on fascist propaganda. He wrote a huge, long 160-page piece on fascist propaganda techniques back in 1937, 38, for publication in the Zeitschrift, which was never published, but has come out more recently in a Surkamp edition. And this huge essay describes the sort of the techniques of fascist propaganda, the speaker, the creation of illusory worlds, the diversion of attention away from actual, real economic, social, and political problems to illusory problems, the invocation of enemy figures, the enemy within, the directing of animosity towards figures who are powerless, outsiders and insiders, the creation of fake notions of the people, the folk, and representing the people, even while actually being contemptuous of the people, the creation of so-called charismatic personalities. As leaders reading this and looking at contemporary politics, one reading this work, one is just sort of checking off the checklist, thinking, yes, 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 yes. This is exactly the kind of political tropes that are being played today, and they are prefigured in the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s. And it's quite startling to see them. And we see this also in other works by Frankfurt School writers. We see it in Löwenthal and Gutermann's Prophets of Deceit. We see it in Adorno's work on fascist agitators on the radio, for instance, Martin Luther Thomas back in the 1930s, and the kind of rhetorical devices that they're using. So these, so just in terms of pure this kind of political, political messages, speeches, rhetorics are used, the kinds of figures, the kind of techniques of repetition, kind of particular tropes that are used. There is nothing new there. And these writings have absolutely super relevant for our understanding, I think, of the politics of today. And of course, that's then ramped up by, of course, the new developments of today. You know, it's not just that they're just recycling old forms, but they're using, of course, new technologies, new sites, new media platforms, social media. These become the new ways in which these ideas can circulate, not the old newsreels and films and things like that. You know, always these are searching out these forms of vicious hate speech, are always seeking out the newest forms of circulation and dissemination as well. So I think they're really acutely relevant. And then when we look at these figures, I think Esther's work is exactly right about these figures of destitution, these figures of exile, the experience of exile, the displacement and dispossession. These kinds of experiences, the experience of Krakow uses the term spiritual shelterlessness. These kinds of experiences are not just the experiences of the white-collar workers, as Krakow was writing about them, Die Angestellten, back in 1929, but these kind of experiences are becoming, you know, the experiences of so many people now in the age of this sort of mass displacements of people as well. So I think these kinds of experiences, these kind of catastrophic experiences, shock experiences, these kinds of things are incredibly relevant to us today. Talking about if I can make one last point, just about the kind of the end of where I got to with the notion of sort of ghosts and hauntings, work of Mark Fisher and people like that. I think this is also where we see this notion of recovery of different histories, of different stories. And it's not just that we can see their work as relevant for our understanding, critical understanding of populism, of fascism, new forms of fascism today, new media today, but we can also see that they're also anticipating new forms of critique, but also new forms of hopefulness as well, new forms of social action. I know this is something that Esther is very profoundly interested in, that these are politically engaged writers as well, and the recovery of a different tradition, for instance, of different stories, of those who've been excluded, those who've been silenced in the past, a challenge to our notions of history. The city is a site where our history is always being consecrated. It's always, the story of our history is always being told. Esther was talking about sort of street names and the names of buildings. For instance, we could add statues and monuments to that. And we see that. I mean, it's kind of interesting, you know, from one moment was in sort of like 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and suddenly there's an incredible transformation in Eastern Europe, all those Karl Marx LAs and Marx Engels forums and Lenin LA, all those kinds of places, all those names suddenly disappeared and they're all renamed something else, right? All those statues ended up in sort of statue parks. I think pictures of sort of statue parks in sort of the Ukraine or somewhere like that, Belarus, which are just filled with statues of Marx, Engels and these kind of figures, because they were no longer, that history had gone, that had been swept away. Yeah, and of course, our conservative commentators, they weren't lamenting the disappearance of these things at all. They were celebrating. This was a tremendous revolution. It's interesting that now other monuments are being swept away. Names are being proposed that change for other places. Names, places that have colonial history, imperialist history, histories linked to slavery and exploitation. That as soon as these names are being challenged, as soon as these statues, as soon as these monuments are being called into question, then suddenly everybody's being accused of cancel culture. Everyone's been accused of, rewriting history, as if history isn't always constantly being rewritten. And I think that's the point, that the city is a site where we are constantly rewriting history. We are constantly writing stories about who we are, right? And that's precisely why the city is always a site of struggle and contestation. History is always in the making, not because we're making it kind of as it goes along, but because we're making the past as we go along as well, making and remaking that past. And I think this is what Benjamin and Krakauer really bring our attention to, that struggle for the struggles in the present are not just struggles about the present, they're struggles for how we understand everything that's gone before that present and led up to it as well. Not just where we are now is what we're fighting about, but how we've come to be there as well. And whom has set those, whose stories dominate and whose stories have been marginalized and excluded. And that for me, I think, is what is so important about the legacy of their work. There are sort of questions popping up in the chat.
Let's go to a second. Can I just quickly, just before we start this, just ask you one question that I actually asked Esther, and that is to say, if Benjamin had made it across the States, as Krakauer had done, as Brecht had done, as Adorno had done, what do you think he would have made of the place? I mean, I think that Adorno went back to Germany as soon as he could. And meanwhile, I think that Krakauer, of course, went on to become a very famous film theorist there. But would he have been like Baudrillard in kind of dismissing it in terms of kind of this desert of culture? Or would he have been more engaged as somebody who was using radio and so on? Would he have seized upon that as a kind of platform for in a productive way? How do you think he would have responded to American culture?
Was Esther, was that directed to Esther, Neil?
No, to you, Esther.
Oh, it is to me, right? Okay. Well, I think it's a great question. I think there is a very lovely book called The Manhattan Project, which is I'm just trying to think. David, I can't even think of his name. I know the guy very well in some ways. It's called The Manhattan Project, and it is a kind of imagining of, I don't know if you know the book, Neil, but it's a sort of imagining of that Benjamin makes it to New York, precisely that counter history, and he abandons immediately the Arcades Project and sets about writing an Arcades Project about New York instead. which he calls the Manhattan Project. Of course, there's a pun on the notion of the Manhattan Project. And writes and lives into the 1980s and writes, and then there are a whole series of parallels that are being drawn between various figures. Instead of Baudelaire, we might have Andy Warhol, or instead of Manet, we might have Andy Warhol, etc. Instead of the boulevards, we have the skyscrapers. Instead of the arcades, we have the department stores or the whatever it might be. And it's a wonderful, absolutely wonderful book, incredibly imaginative. And I'm very much in sympathy with that kind of line. That I think you know, kind of there are many. Of course, there's much speculation about the Arcades project and would Benjamin have finished it? Would he have elaborated it? What would he have done with it, etc. I kind of like the idea that he would have just left it behind in some way and done something completely different. You mentioned sort of Baudrillard and America, and that's a very kind of controversial kind of line. I'm very attracted to Baudrillard's work. I really like so much of it. I know that's the next session is going to be looking at Baudrillard, and I see a lot of continuities, some ruptures, many ruptures, but also some continuities with the sort of critical theory kind of work, a set of provocations, set of fascinations. I'm going to leave that one open, but I do think that one of the important things for Benjamin was this engagement with new technologies. Actually, in the author as producer, he's very much concerned with centering the work of the author today as not shying away from new sites of production, new settings, new forms of literary craft. Craft is a sort of a rather archaic word. Craft and activity. And new locations where the author can situate themselves in political writing. So I think Benjamin would actually be very do exactly what I don't, which is actually engage and embrace new technologies, new forms of communication, precisely these kinds of events like these kind of webinars, because these are new sites for the dissemination of ideas. These are new sites for contestation. These are new spaces and technologies and new formats as well for communication. And I think Benjamin was very attracted to those. So I think he would be he'd be very much at home in the new media universe that we inhabit now.
Yeah, I just want to maybe throw out a couple of comments. I mean, one, alongside Baudrillard, of course, there's Umberto Eco, who also came to the States and was very disparaging about the States. Yes. Yeah. But there are in architecture, there are two figures who are much more positive in a way. There's Rainer Banham, who wrote about the concrete Atlantis and so on, and he really saw the possibility, especially of cities like LA and so on, and understood them and appreciated and learned to drive in order to go and experience LA as it should be experienced. But also Rem Koolhaas, who, I mean, I can't help but see similarities between Koolhaas's writing and Benjamin's writing. At one point, I was asked to write something for Koolhaas about Koolhaas, which is a terrible thing to do, and I kept on seeing him as a kind of Benjaminian figure. You know, again, kind of celebrating technologies like the elevator, the lift, and things, and how they had transformed the city. But, you know, in many ways, you know, exactly the same. And maybe his retroactive manifesto for Manhattan was in some sense a bit like the kind of the idea of prehistory of the modern that Benjamin was kind of looking at. I see, to my mind, I see an enormous amount in Rem Koolhaas's writing that is very Benjaminian. Of course, he doesn't mention this. He doesn't really reveal his sources, so we don't know. But I can't, as a commentator, can't help but think that that maybe Benjamin would have done something like a Delirious New York, perhaps. I don't know. So anyway, we have some questions here, which are in the chat. Maybe, I don't know which one we'll start with. Maybe I could, there's one from Matt Gorbey. Let me try with this one first. Benjamin helps us see in detail the radical shifts of urbanization, speeding up and dehumanizing, fetishizing the activity while diminishing certain humans within the responsibility of within and responsible for the city. I'm wondering how we can take this perspective further now, thinking about our new personal abilities to collapse time and space, record everything, replay anything via our devices. The decentralized production of TikTok or YouTube is sometimes held up as means for anyone to be seen, but is also shown as so dehumanizing, superficial. So how do you think Benjamin might have seen this, do you think?
It's a great question. I think Benjamin. So I mean, one of the interesting things I think for Benjamin is that he, as I said, is a kind of embrace of new technologies and a search for how they might be, how they would in some way radically change forms of perception, how they might be. Certainly how they transform our experience. There is a very strong element of critique. He is also an embrace of these things as well. So film being the obvious example here. So I think, yeah, all these things that you mentioned, things like sort of dehumanizing, fetishizing, all these kinds of things, I think that's absolutely right. I think Benjamin would also, a sort of Benjaminian approach would also be to look at the sort of tensions, look at the complications of, look at the sort of the dialectics, if you like, of these kinds of aspects. I think one of the interesting aspects of, for instance, this, let's just take, you know, the sort of the way in which people take photographs of themselves, selfies, constantly these days. You know, what is going on there? It's a kind of very interesting, when you stop and think about it, what's actually taking place. It's a very interesting set of sort of temporal adjustments that are taking place experientially. Imagine, because let's say you take a selfie of yourself in front of the Eiffel Tower or something. What's going on there is, and I think I can't think of the writer who sort of mentions this, but there's a kind of anticipation now. There's a kind of imagination in which you're sort of stepping outside of yourself and saying, here I am in front of the Eiffel Tower, and I'm going to take a picture of this, because at some point, either I'm going to send this to someone who's going to look at it, or I'm going to look at it. I'm going to look back at this particular moment, right? And so I'm kind of storing this moment, I'm freezing this moment for a future, for some indeterminate future moment when I'm going to look at it, right? And I'm kind of freezing that experience now. So what's kind of interesting is that there's a kind of in taking a photograph now, we're already looking forward to a time, it's the time of its reading later on, right? So there's a kind of a sort of anticipatory moment. And I think that anticipatory moment may be a kind of, okay, so let me run with this idea just for a moment, because I'm thinking of it as I'm sitting here, right? So don't hold me to any of this. But I wonder if it's a kind of utopian moment that's being envisaged in the future, when you're going to look back and you're going to see that picture of yourself in front of the Eiffel Tower 30 years ago. You're saying, oh, look at that. There I was doing this, da, 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 da. And that's a moment then of nostalgia. You're already anticipating a kind of moment of nostalgia 30 years hence. Right. So what kind of experiences, how are we thinking about our lives when we're thinking about it as a kind of a nostalgia that won't be experienced for another 30 years? Yeah. And I think so, that I think the kind of the way in which experience is being reconfigured by technology is very complicated. On the one hand, we can say, oh, selfies are just about, you know, instantaneousness. They're precisely that expression of the disposable. They're precisely the expression of a fascination and preoccupation with the now. They're a kind of, you know, a refusal of temporality in some way. They're a kind of instant gratification, all those kinds of things. And I think yes, that's true. And that'd be one way of thinking about them. But I think there's another way of thinking about them, which actually has a very kind of multiple and kind of complex ways of thinking about time, place, where I will be, what I will be looking at, what I will be thinking about when I look back at this particular moment. You know, it's kind of like a sort of Bart's kind of future prophet looking backwards, or whatever that expression is, backwards looking prophecy. So I think that kind of, when we start unpacking that, I think that's actually kind of really kind of quite interesting. So I think that there's a, when we think about the way in which our lives have been accelerated, when we think about how we engage with these technologies, even the technologies we have now, let alone the technologies we have in 30 years' time, and AI and all this kind of stuff, Internet of Things, I think that there is some really interesting and complex thinking about how our lives and our relationships and the way we think about ourselves, our experience, are actually bound up with these technologies. And I think that's what Benjamin does. He's one of those great thinkers who looks at film not just as something that we watch, but something that transforms our experience of the world. And so when we think about this, we have to think about that kinds of transformation in complex and multiple ways.
I'm just wondering whether, I mean, I think the notion of the blasé individual that is somehow kind of got this protective layer. And when I think about the selfie, I think about Christopher Lasch and the kind of the culture of narcissism that is kind of like has become dominant. I mean, he was writing about that 30, 40 years ago before the culture of the selfie. But I kind of get this notion of the cocooning of this kind of, which is also to do with the kind of the way one wears headphones or whatever these days, and the kind of way in which we become in these bubbles of ourselves, and that are kind of reinforced in many ways by the social media that's been fed to us according to the algorithms that know what we want. So I kind of see this kind of cocoonization of something that has been a manifestation of what is happening as an extension of what Benjamin and Zimmel were thinking about.
Yeah, I think I think a notion of self-cocooning. I mean, Michael Bull, professor of media studies down at Sussex University, did a couple of those sort of pioneering studies of the see if anyone can remember this, the Walkman and the iPod, and the way in which those mobile musical technologies were used. And kind of, it was kind of interesting because, yes, one of the ways was in which people use this as a form of cocooning, precisely in the way you're describing there, Neil, as a way of avoiding contact with people, as this way of showing unavailability for social interactions, as a way of sort of self-preservation, as a sort of precisely that as a sort of casing around the self to ward off contingency, particularly on things like public transport and things like that. I think what's really interesting about Bull's work, and he does come out of a kind of he's kind of drawn to sort of Frankfurt School kind of ideas in an interesting way, is that he does actually quite a lot of ethnographic work and interview data. One of the interesting things about it was the way in which people use music to provide a kind of soundtrack to the city. Yeah. So they play particular pieces of music, perhaps in particular spaces, that places actually take on significance for people. This is where I met my lover. This is where I met my, so, whatever it may be. So this place has a special meaning. And that meaning is then attached to a particular kind of song. And this may sound very sentimental, but suddenly spaces are much more than just spaces, much more than just structures. They're invested with affect. They're imbued with meaning. They're imbued with sometimes very sentimental meanings, but nevertheless they have a significance which makes them more than just non-places, the sort of non-lieu of Auger's description, that they take on significance. And those places, as places take on significance, it kind of transforms the urban setting in some way. Suddenly the whole of the city becomes a series of sites of encounters, of meaningful spaces. And the role of music in that, and the role in which music becomes a soundtrack to the city, I think is kind of echoing sort of like film soundtracks. I think it's kind of quite an interesting idea. So I think I guess the point I'm making here is that kind of like the relation, what's interesting is that the city becomes a media space. And there's an implosion of media. Our experience of media and our experience of urban space are absolutely inseparable now. And that's not just because we've seen so many cities on screen. That's not just because we wander around as avatars. We wander around game spaces, for instance, doing various things. If you want to visit, 16th century Florence, probably the best thing to do is go and play Assassin's Creed or something. Kind of avoid the tourists. But then the city and media. It's not just that the city there's a site of media hoardings and all those kind of things, but actually our entire experience of the city is now bound up with the kind of media experiences that we have as well, and the media that go walk around with us. And I think that actually is, in many ways, it's something new because it seems so immersive and so total. But I just think going back to your point about sort of self-cocooning, Neil. One of the things I'm kind of working on at the moment is photographs of people on the Paris subway system, for instance, taken by Luc Delahaye and Chris Marker about 10 years ago. And the number of people, of course, with their headphones on, doing precisely that self-cocooning work. But they're working in a long tradition going back to Walker Evans and the 1930s, and many are called, where we see a series of pictures of subway shots taken in New York of people reading newspapers. And the newspapers are right up in front like this, right? And that's self-cocooning as well, right? So the use of media as these kind of self-cocooning tools is not new. Yeah, it may be different with your little pods in, but it's not new. And I think, the interesting thing is that sort of Benjamin and people like Zimmel are precisely the people who are identifying these kind of public transport systems as they're coming to being and creating new experiential problems, which media actually solve for them in some way. So I think that Benjamin and Zimmel and Krakow are all interested in this collision, this coalescing of mediascapes and cityscapes as they come into being, as they kind of multiply and complexify as well.
I'm just thinking, of course, that Krakow's hotel lobby was precisely that. People burying themselves in the newspapers, self-cocooning, right? That was...
Yeah. Hopefully, reading articles by Benjamin and Krakow. That's their audience as well. They're the people who are actually reading. They're writing in the newspapers, and they're writing about the people who are reading the newspapers. And that's kind of really interesting, because that also goes back to the kind of you mentioned narcissism is a figure of sort of falling in love with yourself, of course, in front of the pond, the mirror. But of course, the articles themselves then mirroring the very people who are reading them. So holding up that newspaper is like holding up a mirror, a kind of textual mirror to yourself as you read about the white-collar workers, which was first published in the Frankfurter Zeitung in installments as a newspaper. Writing about white-collar workers. And there you are, a white-collar worker on the U-Bahn going home at evening, reading precisely about yourself. So it's kind of it's fascinating set of interrelations there.
Let me just pick up on something. I want to get some questions from some of those who are furthest, far-flung geographically far-flung situations. Christina Dreyfus Serrano, who's in Lima, Peru. She asks the question, do you know if Walter Benjamin was familiar with the work of Impressionist painting? Some of the ideas made me think about the way Manet looked at the city, the bar at the Folie Bergère, optical unconscious races at Longchamp.
Yeah, no, I don't have a definitive answer to that. But it seems to me that Benjamin was certainly drawn to certain elements of Impressionism, and I think clearly Baudelaire writes about Manet and not just the barmaid of the Folie Bergère, but also of course about Olympia. And these kind of at the time revolutionary and shocking images which scandalized Paris. And I think that Benjamin is really interested in precisely the kinds of play of mirrors and reflections that and distortions that are captured in something like Manet's Barmaid at the Folies Bergère, for instance, where you see the mirror in the background sort of reflecting the customer, who kind of is you, but is also not very easy to recognise. So I think, I mean, what the Impressionists are concerned with, as I understand it, I'm not an art historian, but is about things like notions. It's precisely a response to the challenge of photography. Yeah, if we can now have these perfect analog representations of the real, where does painting go at that particular moment? And of course, it goes to capturing what photography can't. It's about capturing color. It's about capturing movement. It's about capturing light. It's about capturing the fleeting. It's about capturing precisely modernité, as Baudelaire described it. And of course, his exemplary figure there is Constantin Guy, the sort of guy who does these like sketches, very rapid sketches of the Parisian street scenes. So I think Impressionism is a hugely important sort of backdrop to some of the things that Benjamin is interested in, even though I'm not sure how frequently he actually mentions Impressionist art itself. Not very often, as I recall. Krakauer explicitly engages with expressionism, German expressionism, which he's not a big fan at all, interestingly. Although and this again comes out of Zimmel, he's interested in this relationship between sort of inner expression and the outer world. And expressionism is, of course, very much about that kind of expressing the self and one's perceptions of the world rather than the way the world may seem. It's about how it's being experienced. And Krakauer's very critical of that. It's very critical of it as a very memorably described it as a humorless art form or set of art practices, which I think is really interesting. But I think Benjamin is really interested in things like these kind of modernist art movements in relation to the challenges that they oppose to them by photography and in the way, and also in their sort of techniques, I suppose. Impressionism again, sort of Seurat and the use of pointillism, in using these little fragments to create like little pixels, almost anticipating our digital age. This sort of use of little fragmentary brush moments, points of color, points of light, to create these kind of images is a kind of technique which Benjamin would see as a model of a sort of textual practice. Again, this sort of notion of a mosaic. So I think there are some really interesting connections between Benjamin and a movement like Impressionism, which I'm sure maybe have been teased out by critics subsequently. But I don't think there's been that much explicit work on Benjamin and Impressionism, to my knowledge. But I may be completely wrong.
There's a question here which I think just popped up. It's an interesting one. This is from Eleanor, who is from Moscow via New York. I mean,
Right.
More than anything else, you see Moscow through Berlin, kind of comment from Benjamin. And she asks, if the flaneur was a figure of modernity, what is the figure of our time? I'm kind of thinking to myself, the hacker or something like that. I don't know. What do you think? If the flaneur was a figure of modernity?
Great question. Yeah, I think in a general sense, the browser, I think, the person who just scrolls through, uses their phone just to scroll through stuff. The there was a famous advert for Yellow Pages phone books, which said, "Let your fingers do the walking." I don't remember that one. That's what we do now. We let our fingers do the walking, right? Scrolling through information, scrolling through screens, scrolling through entertainment, flicking, switching. I think that's the sort of, so in some ways, the sort of definitive figure of today. The browser. The state of distraction, which I think Benjamin and Krakow both start to articulate a concept of distraction, and actually start to sort of see distraction as a really interesting and denigrated form of perception. You know, Adorno is very much into, you know, horrified by the notion of distraction, that one must attend to the work of art and listen, and the capacity for listening has gone, he argues. But I think Benjamin and Krakow are both fascinated by the notion of different modes of reception in distraction. So I think the browser, who is just the emblematic figure of distraction, would be my pitch. But you know, great question.
No, that's a great answer. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. Let me. I want to kind of go through some of these. There's one. We have one from. Hold on a second. Let me try and find this. We have one from from Vascore in Bangladesh. When Benjamin writes about the fulfillment of the childhood wish, his emphasis falls on the experience of completion. What could compare the level of history to childhood experience?
Sorry, I'm just looking. I'm just finding that one. What could compare at the level of history to childhood experience? Okay, that's a great question. I think this probably starts to take us into the realms of Benjamin's sort of messianic writings. In the thesis on the concept of history, it's a very curious sort of mixture of kind of, as you know, Neil, kind of, and people probably know, a very curious mixture of sort of revolutionary ideas and ideas from Judaic mysticism and messianism as well. So I think this is part of this notion of the notion of completion. The experience of completion would be a kind of messianic idea of fulfillment at the end of time. And I kind of think that Benjamin actually Benjamin's rather resistant to these ideas of completion, though. I think he's rather resistant to these ideas of the end of things, in the sense that I think he's much more interesting in the ongoing and the fragmented and the broken and the incomplete and the unfinished, and that things are always unfinished in that sense. Completion is perfection. Completion is sort of finality. Completion is also the sense that something is done and dusted and over with, and that can only come at the end of time, the moment of messianic transcendence or destruction or whatever it may be. But I think what Benjamin's interested in is that of keeping alive different possibilities. So, I mean, if we take the notion of the text, for instance, that for someone like Benjamin, and this is very much sort of anticipating sort of, you know, sort of post-structuralist ideas, really. You know, the text is always open to interpretation. It's always open to new interpretation. As we move into new times, it's always open into reconfiguration. It's always being reassessed, because history is always being reassessed, because we're always reflecting upon it in new ways. That what a text means today, it will mean something different in 10 years' time. In other words, there's no completion, there's no finished reading of something. In other words, history is open to reconfiguration. That's why we struggle for it now. Right, the dead will not even be safe if the enemy wins, he says in the thesis on the concept of history. The dead are to be fought for. as well. Their memory is to be fought for. And so this is precisely the notion of the dialectical image, the moment at which the past is being redeemed by the present. He uses a beautiful metaphor. He uses a photographic metaphor, a flash, the lightning flash of the moment of recognition of the then and there in the here and now. And so that is a continual process, I think. So I think that in a way, what I would emphasize with Benjamin is his thinking of the incomplete and the open-endedness and the continual reconfiguration of things as processual rather than the idea of completion.
Yeah, I think great answer. Just I want to. There's a question here from Harith Al Saidi, who's in Baghdad in Iraq, which is great. And he asked a question in terms of digital spaces, which we deal with today through cyberspace, VR, and ambient intelligence. What kind of aspects can we merge with modernity perspective as designers and architects? I was just thinking as you were talking about, the way in which Benjamin deploys a kind of a vocabulary related to the camera, the snapshot of the European intelligentsia. He has this moment when he talks about how when you're told about the death of an auntie, it kind of imprints this kind of the space in which in which you are at the time when you hear this onto the mind, as though by the flash of the magnesium powder, the kind of flash of the photography and so on. So there were all this kind of incredible terminology that he used from photography. I mean, I guess in some ways, to turn Harriet's question around a little bit round, is how would he respond to these new VR and cyberspace and ambient intelligence, or even AI itself as a kind of a way of a repertoire of technical things that might open up things of how we might see the world. But anyway, that was Harriet's question anyway about.
This is starting to get way out of my territory. This is more your territory than mine, Neil, I think. I mean, I would make some sort of general comments, and then maybe I'll say something sort of just to well, maybe I'll just start with the specific. Let's I suppose what these new media and technologies do is that they allow us to reflect upon our experience, our sort of face-to-face embodied experience. I mean, we could say that what's happened over the last year and a half with COVID, 2 years, whatever, however long it's been, a year and a half, transferring teaching online, these kinds of events, webinars like this, for instance. On the one hand, they've sort of shown us the possibilities of these sort of technologies, or accelerated our embrace of these kinds of technologies. I think one of the interesting things they've done also, which has been great, because our universities would have collapsed without them. Although maybe that wouldn't necessarily be such a bad thing sometimes. But what they've shown is what technology can do. I think what it's also shown is what technology can't do. And I think what's interesting is the way in which our students anyway, at Lancaster, seem to be so delighted to be back in the classroom, so delighted to be doing things face to face, as I am as well. Because, well, why? What have we missed? What have we lost through those being reliant on these kinds of events? For instance, only on these kinds of events. So I think what's kind of interesting is that the technology has given us enormous kind of possibilities, and that's how we often think about these technologies as kind of prosthetic technologies, or whatever they may be, as that transform our experiences, that transform our possibilities, etc., etc., etc. But also, I think these technologies also enable us, or prompt us, or should prompt us to think about what is missing then from them, and what is it that we value about the interpersonal, the face-to-face, the the being present together. You know, I mean, our teaching patterns go back to, you know, Socratic dialogues and conversations, and, you know, our language is geared around colloquia, speaking together, symposia, all these kinds of events. You know, the teaching style of the university has hardly changed, although we've now got PowerPoint. It's hardly changed since the, you know, the medieval period, in terms of small groups of students or large groups of students, and talk. Yeah, so an enormous transformation. But what is it then that we've lost? What is it that we actually then miss about the intimacy of being in the same space? What is it that we miss about the figure of the storyteller, for instance? What is it to tell stories, and can you tell stories online in the same way? So I think there's something about these technologies which, on the one hand, they create these new possibilities, and as I said, Benjamin was very much into and excited by grasping and seizing these kind of opportunities, new technologies, new techniques, new forms of communication. He worked on the radio, for instance, which we haven't mentioned. You know, kind of like, it's hard to imagine Benjamin doing radio broadcasts for children, but that's what he did. And, you know, and some fascinating works as well, not just Broadarbeit, not just sort of for the money, but some really interesting works as well for the radio. So he's very much engaged, you know, kind of the notion of sort of public sociology, which we hear about so much these days in my discipline anyway. You know, so Benjamin was very much a sort of, you know, interested in that wider communication. But also, I think we also have to think about how it makes us reflect upon our experience and what we value in experiences. So let me just give you, if you don't mind me just going on just for one more minute, Neil. Imagine we wanted to be flâneurs or flâneuses online, for instance. How could we do that? How can we do that during COVID? You know, it'd be easy. It'd be relatively simple, wouldn't it? We'd go on Google Earth. We go on Google Maps. We would go down into the city, any city that we wanted in the world. We could go to any of the cities that you are in here now. We could go to Lima. We could go to Baghdad. We could go to Moscow. We could go to New York, wherever it may be. We could go to where I am now, Manchester. And we could drop ourselves in at street level and we could slowly move our way around the city streets, looking at the city, just as a flaneur does, right? We could do that. We could walk at street level around cities that we've never been to, right? Okay, cities that have already had their pictures taken for us, if you like, that have already been mapped out, but we would choose, we could negotiate, we could navigate, we could become flaneurs. We could all go now and become, do a bit of flannery around, I don't know, where would you like to go, Neil? Let's pick a city, you know, I don't know, Buenos Aires, you know, off we go. And we could do that, and we could do that immediately after this webinar as well. And we could do that, and we could explore, and we could see the city. I was looking at Trieste a few weeks ago, for instance, because I've never been there. I'll probably never go, but I've seen Trieste. But now here's the point. But what would we miss? What would the flaneurs gain? What is that embodied experience of walking in urban space? What would be the sensations that we would not have? What about the sounds? What about the smells? What about the touch of these places? What about the sunlight? What about the warmth? What about all those things, all those impressions that we would not have, that would be lost, right? And I think for me, one of the beautiful things about Benjamin's city writings and Krakau's city writings as well is the way that they bring that sense of affect, emotion, sensory experience, rhythms. Lefebvre is wonderful on this as well. All these aspects of urban life, they bring these into their texts. The Marseille essay by Benjamin, for instance, is perhaps the epitome of that, the sense of smell, the sense of touch, all these kinds of things. So what that disembodied experience is such an experience based upon the visual, right? Now, how might that change again with virtual reality, for instance? Right? So here's my final thing I'm going to say about this. I could talk about this at length because I found it really interesting. I saw that the Louvre were doing an exhibition I think it was marking Leonardo's, whatever it is, 500th. But the problem with the Louvre is that the Mona Lisa is so popular that you can hardly get to see it now. And there's the crowds, and it's terrible. It's awful. So what they've done is they've set up a room. I think this is true. Please correct me. I may have misread this. They've set up a room in the Louvre where you can put on a VR headset and you can walk around. It's got all of many of Leonardo's pictures, including the Mona Lisa. And you walk around the room in your VR headset and you can stand in front of the Mona Lisa because there's no one else there. Or there are other people, but they're all walking around with their headsets on. And you can stand and you get as close as you like. And then there's a little commentary that tells you all about the Mona Lisa. Of course, I mean, two things strike me about that is, what is this experience exactly? This is exactly what Benjamin's talked about, the notion of aura. What exactly is this new experience now that VR is offering us? How does it compare with looking at the Mona Lisa? But the other one is that I wondered why on earth I would have to go to the Louvre to do this. Why can't I just order the headset on Amazon or something, which I wouldn't want to do, but anyway, order the headset and they could send it to me and I could put it on and I could walk around here in my room here and look at these paintings. In fact, I can look at any paintings of anywhere, any museum in the world in my own home. I don't need to go anywhere in actual fact. So what we see is a kind of technology you need. That we had the VR, but the logic of it, which was it could be anywhere. No, you still need to be in the Louvre. This may be to something to do with paying the entrance fee to go in the Louvre or something, but it has nothing to do with the technology. So it's kind of really interesting about how our experiences of art, our experience of media, our experiences of cities are being completely transformed, completely reconfigured, potentially by these. But the question is, of course, what is lost and what is at stake in those kinds of transformations? Sorry, Neil, that's an incredibly long answer, but
it's a fantastic answer. We've got one comment from Marissa Bell Marrett, which I want to maybe kind of make some comments. I think children is something to pick up on in a moment. Later on, I'll just want to say a few words. But Marissa Bell Marrett has got a comment, and Marissa Bell Marrett has been helping to organise this, and she's also going to be organising another doctoral consortium session for Georgia Tech next semester. Marissa, first of all, thank you for this discussion. You got a lot of big fan club in the chat there. Fantastic, thank you, Graeme. Denise says, at what point does the multiplicity of experiences afforded by the new city, likened to the fragmentation and play of mirrors and glass architecture, eventually become a flattening and then annihilation of the digressions and labyrinths that seem a methodological contrivance that allows our phantasms a platform? I don't know if you can catch that. Is scrolling the same as idea of spatiality as a labyrinth? I think she's kind of. I think yes. That's to what point is our experience being flattened? The labyrinthine and so on that you were referring to. I think it's a very nice question.
Yeah, phantasms a platform is scrolling the same idea of spatiality as a labyrinth. No, I don't think so. I think it's scrolling the same idea of spatiality as a labyrinth. That's a really good question. Let me take the top half of what you've written. Yes, I agree very much with the kinds of things that I think the spirit in what you're writing there, the multiplicity of experiences afforded by the new city. I think that's right. I think I mean, we could think about the kind of, I suppose this connects up with kind of potential critiques of contemporary cities as sort of subject to sort of Disneyfication, theme parkization, simulation, the mauling of our cities, the the kind of transformation of them into consumer and touristic kinds of spaces, in which the illusion of self-determination, the illusion of flannery, the illusion that we are in control of our destinations and movements is precisely that, is a set of illusions, because our movements are being more and more subject to surveillance. They're being more and more subject to quantification through various kinds of big data. They are being more and more subject to monitoring and recording and algorithms created by sensors, where we shop, every time we use a credit card, where we go. Our clothes have sensors attached to them these days. Sensors are activated as we walk around. The technology becomes, maps us in so many ways. And our opportunities for movement become so choreographed by architects, really, by architects and designers, who have read their Benjamin, who have read their Baudrillard, who have read their architectural theory. And we see those kind of, classics of those kind of imploded spaces, like, airport settings, for instance, where, you go to an airport, and it's when we go back to an airport anyway, whenever that may be, we'll return to an airport, and it's kind of like, before you get to the gates, it's like you have to negotiate the shopping mall before you get there. And it's not that you used to sort of pop into the duty-free shop on your way to the gate. It's now that you have to go through the duty-free shop on your way to the gate. In fact, that's the only path through, and it's made as difficult as possible for you to find your gate. You'd imagine that an airport would be about moving people as swiftly as possible from A to B, so that they can get on their plane and leave. That would seem the logic of an airport, but no, the logic of an airport now is making you go through a labyrinth called the duty-free area before you even get there. Hiding all those signs which will tell you where your gate actually is. So yes, we are subject to manipulation. We are subject to this being choreographed in space, being directed, and that's at the level of materiality, by putting things in our way. That's at the level of signs telling you to go this way rather than that way. That's in the form of disciplinary instructions. Don't do this, do not enter here, do not go there. So yes, we are being taken on tours which are predetermined and preset for us. And that's the same as kind of scrolling in a way. A labyrinth is a place in which there's a possibility of getting lost. I think actually we don't really have those. In today's city, you don't get lost because, first of all, that you can always look at your phone to tell you where you are. But more importantly, it's because you're always being directed. Anyone who has ever been to an IKEA store will know that before you can actually get to the flat pack furniture that you've actually gone there to buy, you will have already spent half your money buying stuff as you walk through all the other stuff that you have to get to the flat pack area. So all these spaces are being designed to monetize your trajectories through the city. So I think there is a kind of flattening of experience. There's also a kind of artificial intensification of experience through theming. There's a Disneyfication of experience. There's a touristification of experience, and there is a sort of as I said, I've used the term 3 times or at least already, but about a choreographing of our experience. And I think this sort of begs the question then, how do you break with that? How do you find other kinds of ways of negotiating the city? How do you find other routes and destinations? And this goes back to, could go back to writers like Guy Debord, the Situationists, who we mentioned. I think one term here that we would introduce would be that of spectacle, the city as spectacle. But people like Debord who are interested in a different kind of urbanism, and above all in notions of détourement, but in terms of physical being in the city, notions of the dérive, a different kind of walking, which precisely walks, if you like, the wrong way down one-way streets, and is precisely about not being drawn to those expected places, to sort of going in through the outdoor, as someone once put it, not walking through IKEA, but just going in where it says "do not enter." That is a way of at least trying to break with, or not going there at all, even better, a way of breaking with some of the ways in which architecture becomes highly complicit in neoliberalism.
It's what we ought to wrap things up. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thanks, Graeme, so much. And I would love to if you could make it next week for our poetry art session as well. Because
yeah, that sounds great.
That's great. I just wanted one thing. But I'm not going to show you my presentation because I had something that was prepared. But what I wanted to simply say is well, maybe I'll show a couple of slides. I think that Benjamin on radio talking to children actually wasn't. I think he relished this. I think the figure of the child is something that is absolutely central to Benjamin. I think that he was fascinated by the way that they could play hide and seek and become part of their environment and would let out a shriek to save themselves from that. He spoke about how he was chasing after butterflies and he became a butterfly himself. And there are lots of different sort of references in his work, which is really beautiful. There is something that is to my mind, the childlike imagination, which of course was an anti-commodity thing. Give a child a present and the child will forget about what's in the box and play with the box itself. I think the figure of the child was something very privileged and innocent in some ways, but with a kind of imagination, a capacity to imagine itself. And I wanted to just show you one quote, which I found lots of things in Benjamin. I almost felt that he was writing for children, but in an adult way. It's a bit like The Simpsons, right? It wasn't really about children; it was something else. But maybe I just want to show you a couple of comments that I just found absolutely beautiful in the way that he was talking about things. I mean, one was I mentioned that I find Benjamin a collector. I mean, of course, he went to Moscow and came back with a collection of toys for kids and things. Why did he do that? I know. And he was a collector of postcards. His grandmother sent him postcards. And this kind of comment, which is absolutely astonishing. He was gazing at his postcards and looking at this kind of these scenes of things. And suddenly I was there. The idea he could transport himself through the childlike imagination as though on some kind of magic carpet. I found that absolutely stunning. And then there's this comment in Illuminations, which is kind of, I didn't understand for a while, what was this reference to the Chinese painter? It made no sense to me about, what's he talking about? Then I came across later in his Berlin Childhood, of course, he was writing about his own childhood and this idea that this story from China about this painter who paints this painting and of this scene. You can imagine this kind of this scene that he's painted, and then inviting his friend to have a look at the painting. Then suddenly the painter's in the painting, wandering down the pathway, and he comments, and so was I. I became part of my painting, and this is just kind of quintessential Benjamin, and I think there's something about it which he's pointing to that is absolutely astonishing. And I think that so I don't think the child is. I think he relished that. I think but it was not a child. It was a grown-up view of a child that was. I don't know. What your thoughts were on that, because that's always been my conviction.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely fantastic, Neil, and those beautiful quotes that you pulled out there. I particularly love the one about the Chinese painter disappearing into thing. I suppose So I think for me, one of the things that Benjamin is amazing, one of the reasons I find Benjamin so amazingly interesting and fascinating and beautiful to read, of course he's a beautiful text to read, is the notion of the fairy story here. And Benjamin's sort of reassessment of the fairy story, and he sort of talks about Kafka as writing dialectical fairy tales, for instance, and Krakow picks up on this as well. And there's some instances where Krakow uses very fairy tale figures as well, which I think is really amazing. Some of the best pieces of Krakow's writing. The notion of the fairy tales, and this is where we come to, I think. But this is not about some sort of like wide-eyed innocence. This is playfulness, yes, but there is purpose in these fairy stories. And fairy stories are also not necessarily, these are not Disney stories, right? Far from it. Some of them are very, as we know, fairy stories can be very grim, if you'll pardon the pun. But I think the notion of fairy stories, Benjamin, there's a really lovely passage where I think it's in the essay on Kafka, where he says that what we see in fairy stories is where the weak characters, children, animals, those who are disempowered, the downtrodden, again, the Cinderellas, the Hansel and Gretels, these kinds of figures, are triumph over powerful evil figures through the use of cunning, through the use of and through the help of enchantment, through the help of benign figures, through the help of figures from nature, animals, for instance, come to the aid of children, and that they end, with the triumph of good over evil. These are stories of the triumph of good over evil. And we dismiss those fairy stories because we grow up and we know the world isn't like that. But actually, if we go back to those, for Benjamin, I think they teach us a really important story and a really important lesson, he says, and that is how we defeat the powers of myth and domination. This is what he says. These are the earliest stories humankind has told itself about how to overcome fear, how to overcome our impotence, how to overcome a sense of impotence, how to realize a better world. And this, I think, is really amazing, because for me, the Arcades project, of course, was a dialectical féerie. He describes it as a féerie. Is not necessarily a fairy story. It's a sort of theatrical event. But if we think about it, though, if we just allow a little bit of linguistic slippage here and think about the Arcades project as a dialectical fairy story, and there are mentions of Schwester Tintchen in one of the early drafts, of a particular figure who walks through a wonderland who has to rescue her brother, but being distracted all the time by beautiful toys and sweets and presents which an evil magician is laying beside the path to distract her from her goal of rescue. And a little bird is on her shoulder or something, who keeps tweeting to her to no, carry on, carry on, carry on, keep going. This is your destiny. This is what you must achieve. Here we see a figure about the world of temptation, the world of commodities, the world of luxury, the world of consumer goods, which acts as a distraction for us. But what is it that we are seeking to achieve? What is our purpose? What is the good life? What is important in our lives? And how do we overcome demonic forces? This is what Benjamin is interested in here. And I think this is, if we think about the Arcades project as a fairy story, not just as a story told to children, but then as a political fable or a parable. And I think this is where we come back to the notion of myth, which you started and you said is a kind of key aspect of this. Because there are two things here. The first is that Benjamin says that we need to disenchant modernity through enchantment, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, if enchantment is the sway of mythological forces, commodity fetishism, for example, our belief in progress, for example, whatever forms of ideology that hold sway in neoliberal society, our misrecognition of the world, the illusions that we live under all the time. If this is the rationalism of our world, if this are the forces of myth and fear and power, then how do we overcome those? Well, we overcome them not actually through kind of like sort of like enlightenment necessarily, but through another form of enchantment. And I think the fairy story is the key to that notion of enchantment, which is about solidarity, it's about companionship, it's about love, it's about childhood, it's about holding on to our imagination. It's about mimesis, for instance, possibly, and its forms. It's about improvisation. It's about playfulness. It's about fun. It's about satire. It's about wit. Wit in both the sense of comedy, but wit also as in knowledge. That's one aspect. Another aspect of this disenchantment through enchantment is, and the notion of mythology, I think it's also that we could start, Horkheimer Adorno famously write Dialectic of Enlightenment. I think there's another book which we could write, which would be the Dialectic of Myth, because what's interesting about these figures is, and critical theory and Benjamin among them, is the way in which they use mythological figures precisely as forms of disenchantment in the world. So we've already mentioned the labyrinth, for instance, and Ariadne. And Horkheimer Adorno opened Dialectic of Enlightenment with the story of Odysseus, who is a figure of wit, of cunning, a fairy story figure about nostalgia and homecoming, for instance, who overcomes the monsters, outwits them, outwits Polyphemus and others. And we see in the work of Marcuse, we see a concern with things like Orpheus. We see in Krakauer a concern with the figure of Perseus. We also see in Benjamin, of course, that amazing moment in Convolute K, in the Arcades Project, where he says, the moment of awakening is like the Greek wooden horse in the Troy of the dream. Again, a figure from mythology, but a figure also about the taking of a city, the recovery of a city, the storming of a city, the transformation of a city, the destruction of a city, through cunning, through ruse, through deception, through wit. It's Odysseus who comes up with the idea of the Greek wooden horse, right? And there you see sort of myth and the city coming together in that image of the Greek wooden horse. What would the Greek wooden horses, what would our Greek wooden horses of today look like? Right? What are the ruses? What are the deceptions? What's the cunning that we need to confront the challenges that we face today in dealing with the catastrophes and catastrophic not the Trojan horse, it's Greek horse, of course. Yeah. What are the ruses? How do we use our wit to draw upon the resources to confront the forces of myth and irrationalism today? I think that's the kind of thing that Benjamin and the figure of the child inspire us towards. And just one last, if I can just have one last thing about this. And interestingly, these kinds of ideas also make their way into film. I'm just thinking here of those of you who've seen, which I think is a wonderful film, almost as good as the first one, Blade Runner 2049, Why is it that the little thing that is passed on, the toy, the childhood toy that is passed on, that is a symbol of, if you like, or represents the revolt of the replicants against the humans, the great AI taking its revenge upon the humans, and the merger of the human and the replicant. Actually, what is it? It's a little wooden horse, a little toy wooden horse. What is the relationship between that wooden horse, right, childhood, and the Greek wooden horse of Troy? Okay.
Or the origami. What is it?
Or the little origami, yeah, the little origami unicorn, yeah, another figure, mythological figure, of course, yeah.
Graeme, we're going to have to wrap it up here. This has been absolutely fantastic. One thing I would say, which I thought was really striking to me, is that you had a presentation with only one image, and yet the way that you speak is incredibly evocative. You conjure up images. The way your words really open up in many ways, and to my mind, anyway, you're kind of painting with words in a very beautiful way. I think this contribution today has been incredibly useful. I hope that I've drawn the attention of the architectural community to your own work, which I think really helps us in many ways. I think that your book on the Metropolis was fantastic, but even more now, I begin to realize that actually all those comments that were being made are really relevant today. I mean, what's become totally clear to me is that that it's not as though that Benjamin is even more relevant and Krakow are too today than maybe they were in the past. And I think this only points towards the need to really revisit and reinterrogate afresh this incredibly provocative thinker. I mean, really an amazing, amazing person. I hope that if we could come along to next week as well for the Baudrillard session, it would be wonderful. I know that you wrote a beautiful essay on seduction in Baudrillard, mimesis, and in Benjamin for Hieroglyphs of Space, and it would be wonderful if you could join us. I just want to thank Graeme for absolutely beautiful work, fantastic. I also want to sort of thank also the background team here, Gustavo, we didn't get to answer his question, but Gustavo was instrumental in making things happen, Marisabel and Victoria were helping to distribute all the information. I wanted to thank FIU. This is hosted by Florida International University as part of their Doctor of Design program, a continuation of the one that was the first doctoral consortium session that was organized by Tongji. We'll hope to have many more, and this is only pointed towards the real necessity and the possibility of opening up in this way to create a platform where everyone around the world is able to share. And I think it was great to have all these figures asking questions from Baghdad and Lima and so on today, and it was fantastic. So thank you, Graeme. Thank you for all those behind who've been supporting this thing, and we look forward to next week, Baudrillard, Francesco Proto, and I hope Graeme Gilloch will be there to talk about Baudrillard, whose connection, in a way, I mean, you can't collapse the two, but somehow there is a kind of segue, as it were, into the work of Baudrillard that is deeply fascinating.
Neil, can I just thank you and again the team for first of all for inviting me and everyone for making this possible, and can I thank everybody who's for the brilliant questions and all the lovely comments and everything in the chat. It's been here we are on a global platform. It's a real honor for me. I want to thank all of you for coming and joining and giving your time and thought and taking part in this. It's been a really wonderful experience. I hope it's been interesting for you. Thank you, Neil. Thank everybody. Thanks to everybody so much for joining us today. It's been such a pleasure, and I hope you've enjoyed it.
We've enjoyed it. I'm trying to think of a Benjaminian phrase or quote to go with it. I can't think right now, but absolutely, I think you've opened up this whole world to us, and I think that it's so important for us to be dealing with this. Thank you, Graeme. Thank you, everyone. You're getting hearts everywhere from Baghdad and whatever. You've got a fan club now, and I hope that I've helped to introduce you to our architecture community. I'm happy to pass on my writings on Benjamin to anyone who wants to ask for them, but it's much more important to listen to Graeme today, and it was really fabulous. So thank you so much, and hopefully see you next week.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.